Hello, everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. I know it might sound weird, and to be honest, I'm not sure if I'll ever really understand what happened to me that day. But I figured I'd share it here, since I've seen people talking about strange experiences in the woods, and maybe someone else has gone through something similar. It was back in 2002, on the Ruckle Creek Trail in Oregon. I was hiking alone, which, yeah, I know, not the smartest move. But I liked the solitude back then, being away from everything, just the quiet of the woods and the trail beneath my boots. I wasn't expecting anything other than a peaceful afternoon. It was a late afternoon, the kind where the sun's just starting to dip behind the treetops, and the shadows get a bit longer, making everything feel just a little more isolated. I'd been out there for hours, just meandering, not really in a rush to get anywhere. Then suddenly I heard it, a noise from the trees. It wasn't subtle. It was a heavy crashing sound, like something big was moving through the underbrush. Instinctively I thought bear, and froze. I mean, what else could it be, right? It wasn't a small rustle. It was like a whole tree was being shoved aside. I remember standing there holding my breath, scanning the thick growth around me. The noise kept getting closer and my heart was pounding. But then I saw it, something dark moving through the trees, heading up the hill to my right. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't moving like one either. It was running, almost in a hunched-over way, but fast, like way faster than I expected. My first thought, oddly enough, was that it looked like a gorilla. The broad back, the massive arms, the way it hunched forward. But it was taller, lankier, and definitely not supposed to be out here. I tried to pull my camera out, one of those old disposable ones. Yeah, remember those? My hands were shaking, and I fumbled with the damn thing, and by the time I managed to get it out, the creature was already disappearing behind this massive fallen log. I didn't even have time to focus. I snapped a picture in that direction anyway, but I knew I'd missed it. My heart was still racing, and for a second I thought about just getting the hell out of there. But curiosity got the better of me, and I crept up the trail a bit further, trying to see if I could spot it again. The air felt different, heavier almost, like the forest had gone quiet after that commotion. No birds, no wind, just this thick silence that made me feel like I was intruding on something I shouldn't be seeing. I kept looking, trying to convince myself that maybe it was just a trick of the light, or my mind playing games. Then, off in the distance, I noticed something. It was hard to make out, like a dark shape between the trees. It almost looked like a face, just barely visible through the branches. I raised my camera again, zooming in as best as that old thing could manage, and snapped another picture. I stood there for a minute, just staring at it, trying to figure out if what I was seeing was real or just some twisted-up tree stump. It felt like it was watching me back, which sounds ridiculous, I know, but that's the feeling I got. Like there were eyes, deep and hidden, just observing me. I didn't get closer. Something in my gut told me not to. I took a step back, then another, and eventually turned around and started heading back down the trail. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone anymore, that whatever I'd seen was still there, just out of sight. When I finally made it back to my car, I was drenched in sweat, more from nerves than the hike itself. I sat there for a while, just trying to make sense of it. I even laughed at myself a bit, trying to brush it off as nothing more than my imagination. But when I got those photos developed, I swear that second one, the one with the face, it still creeps me out. It's blurry, obviously, and I can't say for sure what it is. Most people I've shown it to think it's just a knot in a tree or a shadow, but there's something about it that still makes the hair on my neck stand up. I ended up going back there twice after that, partly because I wanted answers, partly because I just couldn't let it go. Both times it was like nothing had ever happened. The trail was quiet, almost too normal, and I didn't hear or see anything out of the ordinary. No weird sounds, no glimpses of dark shapes moving through the trees. It was just calm. Almost like the forest had swallowed up whatever I'd seen and decided it wasn't going to show itself again. I've thought about it a lot over the years. I mean, I know how it sounds. I saw Bigfoot or whatever, but I'm not even sure if that's what it was. It felt more primal than that, like something ancient that didn't belong in this time or place. It's hard to explain, but the memory of it feels vivid, like it happened yesterday. I can still picture the way it moved, the muscles rippling under its dark fur, the sheer size of it. It wasn't just some guy in a suit, and it definitely wasn't a bear. Every now and then, I think about going back again, just to see if maybe I'll get another glimpse. But there's a part of me that's scared of what I might find, or worse, what I won't. The not knowing is what gets to me the most, I think. Like, did I really see what I thought I saw? Or was it just a trick of the mind, some weird combination of shadows and adrenaline? I guess I'll never really know. But one thing's for sure, I've never felt the same about hiking alone since then. I still hike, but there's always that nagging feeling in the back of my mind, especially when I'm deep in the woods and everything goes quiet. It's like I'm waiting for that sound again, that crashing in the underbrush that tells me I'm not alone. And honestly, part of me hopes I never hear it again. Because whatever it wasn't something I was meant to see. And I think the forest was just reminding me of that. I never thought I'd be here writing such an account, but after so many years of trying to ignore what happened, I think the time has come to share it. We're talking about the 1970s in Lake Quinault. My friend Mike and I used to love riding our motorcycles through the quarries there. We knew every shortcut, every curve. It was our favorite place to spend a few hours and forget about the world. Nothing much happened there, at least until that particular day. It was a Saturday afternoon. The sun was just starting to hide behind the trees, giving the sky an orange tinge, and I remember that the air was heavy, almost stuffy. We were walking slowly, enjoying the scenery and chatting. Suddenly Mike stopped abruptly, pointing to a clearing at the edge of the forest. Something was moving among the trees. At first, I thought it was a stray cow. It was big, thin, and covered in dark hair. It seemed to be coming out of the forest, as if it was about to cross our path. But it was when the thing emerged fully from the shadows that I realized it wasn't a cow. The thing was huge. It must have been 2.5 meters long, and it was walking on 2 legs. Its hair was thick, brown, and covered its entire body. I stood frozen for a second, trying to process what I was seeing. Mike looked at me with an expression I had never seen on him before. Startled, incredulous, he only managed to let out a, "Dude, what the hell is that?" The creature was focused on 2 deer that were grazing up ahead. I swear, at that moment it looked like a scene from a documentary, you know? That giant beast took off running, and the deer shot off in the opposite direction, as if their lives depended on it. The way the thing ran, it didn't look human, but it didn't look totally animal either. It was as if it had perfect coordination, each step long and precise. When the deer moved away, the creature stopped, as if it had lost interest. That's when I felt a chill run down my spine. It looked in our direction for a moment. I don't know if it really saw us or if it just noticed the movement of the motorcycles, but I could feel my neck beating. Mike was so still that I thought he had stopped breathing. The thing then turned around and went back into the forest, disappearing into the trees as if it had never been there. We didn't move for a good few minutes. The noise of the forest gradually returned, but my head was a complete blank. I didn't know what to think. I don't even know how long we stood there, just looking in the direction the thing had gone. Finally, Mike started the bike and gave me a look that said it all. "Let's get out of here." Without a word, we took the same route back, only this time every rustle in the undergrowth sounded like a warning. Every shadow was a threat. When we finally got home, we told Mike's father, hoping for some joke, some rational explanation that would make us laugh at ourselves. But he just gave us a serious look, took a deep drag on his cigarette and said, "You've probably seen a Sasquatch." I remember he said it in such a casual way that it gave me the creeps. It wasn't a joke. It was a real possibility. After that day, we avoided the quarry for a long time. I didn't talk about it much with Mike, but we both knew we didn't want to risk another encounter. However, that wasn't the only strange thing that happened in the area. A few weeks later, we were camping nearby and heard something walking heavily around our tent in the middle of the night. It wasn't a deer or a bear. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, and heavy. We stood in silence, paralyzed, until it went away. Another time, We were returning home after an afternoon of fishing, and we heard a scream. It was a sound I'd never heard before, something between a roar and a wail, coming from the middle of the forest. The kind of sound that makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand up instantly. Mike's dad said it was just animals communicating, but there was something about that sound that seemed much more conscious. Since then, I haven't been able to look at that area in the same way. I remember how normal everything seemed, how those motorcycle rides were simply a way to relax and enjoy nature. Now, every time I go back there, and I admit there haven't been many since, I feel a weight, a sense that we're not as welcome as we thought. I'm not here to convince anyone that it was a Sasquatch. I still catch myself trying to rationalize it, thinking that maybe it was a bear or some kind of animal that I just didn't know about. But none of that makes sense when I remember the details, the way it walked, the way it seemed to understand what it was doing, the impossible height. It wasn't a hallucination. I was there, and so was Mike. I know that for many people this sounds ridiculous, something out of the horror stories we tell around the campfire. But for me, it was real. And that's the problem. When you see something you can't explain, something that doesn't fit in with anything you know, it marks you. You start to doubt reality, the things you've always taken for granted. To this day, I don't know what that really was. Life went on, I moved on, but every time I hear stories about Sasquatch, something turns in my stomach. It's as if, for a moment, I'm back in that quarry, with the sun going down, watching that creature disappear into the trees. The kind of thing you just can't forget. So that's it. Maybe it's not the most exciting story anyone's ever read here, but it's mine. And to this day, every time I see a dense forest, I can't help but wonder what might be hiding there, out of sight. Maybe I'll never know, but honestly, I prefer it that way. I've never been much of a storyteller, but after seeing a few people here sharing similar things, I thought it was worth sharing what happened to Mike and me that night in Satsop. That was in the 80s, and I still remember it as if it had happened yesterday. It was an early morning like any other. We were coming back from a baseball game that had ended late. You know how it is. It's a close game. Everyone stays up afterwards discussing the plays, laughing and so on. By the time we decided to leave, it was well after midnight. Satsop is a small town. Practically nothing happens there. And at that time, there wasn't even much street lighting. We were walking along the dirt road that ran through the woods, chatting about the game and laughing, when we started to hear a noise that honestly gave me a strange feeling. It was kind of a low sound, like heavy footsteps stepping on dry branches. But what alerted me was their regularity. It was no ordinary animal. It didn't sound like a deer or anything like that. At first, we just exchanged a look like, "Do you hear that too?" We tried to ignore it, but as we continued walking, it became clear that it was following us. With every step we took, there was that sound behind us, as if it was mirroring our movements. I'm not one to be easily frightened, but something was wrong. We tried to walk faster, and the footsteps quickened too, without running, but keeping pace with us. That's when Mike turned back and went pale. I didn't need to ask him what he was seeing. I knew there was something there, and it was getting closer. When I looked, my eyes adjusted to the dimness, and I saw that huge silhouette. Covered in grey fur, it was much bigger than anyone I had ever seen. It was at a distance where I could see the shape, but not the details of the face, and that was even more frightening. It was as if the thing was studying us, in no hurry at all, with no intention of hiding. The only thing we could think of was to run. Our hearts were pounding in our throats, and we didn't look back. We ran to Mrs. Thompson's house, a neighbor who lived nearby. I remember banging on the door like crazy, so hard I thought I was going to break the glass. Mike was next to me, looking back every second, and the look of terror on his face told me that the thing was still following us. Mrs. Thompson opened the door looking confused and scared, and we barely had time to explain. I just shouted something like, "There's something, let us in." She stepped out, looked where Mike was pointing, and I'll never forget the look on her face. She saw it. I know she saw it because she froze for a second and then pulled us inside in such a hurry that I almost tripped. She slammed the door, and I remember the sound of the lock being turned. We stood there, in her living room, panting, while she peered through the curtain at the window. "Oh my God!" was all she managed to say. I plucked up the courage to look through the crack and saw the creature standing in the garden. It wasn't trying to get in or anything, it was just standing there, looking at the house. It was as if it knew we were looking back. After a few minutes, which seemed like an eternity, it turned around and started walking towards the river, which was further on. It didn't run, it didn't make any sudden movements. It simply walked away, in such a calm way that it almost made me doubt what I had seen. We were all silent, as if any sound could call it back. Mrs. Thompson just told us to stay there until dawn, and that's exactly what we did. The next day, after the sun had risen, we went out to see if there was any sign of what had happened. And there was. Huge footprints in the garden, marked in the soft earth. They looked human, but they were much bigger and wider, with well-defined toes. We followed the marks as far as the river, but then they disappeared into the water. I remember Mike trying to measure one of the footprints with his foot, and the difference was absurd. It was proof that it wasn't just our imagination. Some people in the neighborhood heard about what had happened, and there was even a small search of the area. They found some strange marks on the trees, as if something had passed through, but nothing that gave any concrete answers. The sheriff showed up, took a look, but in the end, there wasn't much they could do. They said it could have been a bear, but to this day, I know that wasn't it. You can't forget the way it watched us, as if it understood exactly what we were doing. Since then, I've never walked down that road at night again, and whenever I pass that way, even during the day, I still get a chill down my spine. I don't know what it was, and I may never know. But I can say with certainty that it wasn't just any animal, and that it wasn't something that belonged there. It's strange how something like that can change your perspective. No matter how much you try to explain it, I know what I saw, and I know that Mike and Mrs. Thompson saw it too. To this day, when I see her in town, we exchange a look that says it all, without us having to say a word. And maybe that's what scares me the most. The idea that somehow it's still out there, walking through the trees, watching, waiting, and that next time, maybe it won't be so patient. Whatever it is, I hope I never cross its path again. I don't know if anyone here has had something like this happen to them, but what happened to us back in '82 in Elma has haunted me for years. It was supposed to be just a chill weekend, celebrating our high school graduation with a group of close friends, camping out in an isolated field. You know, the kind of place that seems perfect for letting loose without having to worry about neighbors or noise complaints. We were all young, thinking we were invincible, and completely unaware of how bizarre things were about to get. It was just after midnight, the kind of pitch-black night you only find in the middle of nowhere. We had this massive fire going, beer cans scattered around, everyone laughing and swapping stories. At some point, my friend Greg, always the joker, decided he wanted to mess with us. He started making these weird noises, trying to mimic the sound of a wounded animal. Honestly, it was pretty convincing. Sounded like a cross between a rabbit and a deer, but more desperate. I remember rolling my eyes at first, thinking he was just being an idiot, trying to get someone spooked. But then the vibe changed. You could feel it in the air. We all started to notice how quiet everything got. No more chirping insects, no rustling leaves. It was like the whole forest just went dead silent, like something hit pause on nature. The only thing we could hear was the crackle of the fire and Greg's creepy call echoing into the darkness. He kept it up for a minute longer, until even he seemed to sense that something wasn't right. He trailed off, and we were all just sitting there, looking around at each other, waiting for something we couldn't name. That's when we heard it. Footsteps, heavy ones. Not like the crunching of deer or the skittering of a raccoon. These were solid, deliberate thuds. They were coming from the tree line, maybe 20 or 30 yards away from us. Greg grabbed his flashlight, still grinning like he thought he'd just scared a bear or something, and aimed it toward the noise. The beam cut through the dark, and I swear in that moment, everything felt like it stopped. There it was. A massive figure, just standing there. Its eyes reflected back in the light, a dull amber color, not the way animal eyes usually do. I'm talking about something standing maybe 7, 8 feet tall. The head looked almost like a gorilla's, but different, with this strange bump or ridge on the top. almost like a helmet or crown of some kind. Its body was covered in dark, matted hair, and even from where I was, I could see how broad it was, like it could snap a tree in half without trying. Greg's grin disappeared immediately. He just stood there frozen, flashlight still trained on the thing. It didn't move, and for a second, I thought maybe it was just as surprised as we were, but it didn't seem threatening, just curious, maybe even confused. I felt like we were intruding on something we weren't supposed to see. My heart was pounding, and I could hear one of the girls whispering something, but it sounded muffled, like my ears had stopped working right. Greg eventually did the one thing none of us wanted him to do. He turned off the flashlight. I don't know if he thought it would make the creature leave or if he just panicked, but the second that light went out, the darkness swallowed everything around us. I've never felt anything like it, this suffocating blackness, paired with the sense that something enormous was standing just feet away, watching us. We all just sat there, not daring to move. I could barely breathe, trying to listen for any sign of movement. For a minute, there was nothing. No footsteps, no breaking branches, just the sound of our shaky breaths. And then, just like that, we heard it moving again. But this time the steps were retreating, fading into the forest until they were gone completely. It felt like hours before any of us spoke, but it must have been just a few minutes. Greg finally said, "Did you guys see that?" And I think that's when we all knew none of us had imagined it. The rest of the night was a blur. We didn't sleep. Nobody wanted to admit we were scared, but we all ended up huddled closer to the fire, keeping the light as bright as we could until the sun started coming up. At first light, we packed everything and got the hell out of there. None of us talked much on the drive back. It's weird. It wasn't like the thing had attacked us or even acted aggressively, but there was this overwhelming feeling that we had crossed a line, stumbled into something we shouldn't have. I wish I could say that was the end of it, but over the years, I've been back in those woods a few times, and there's always this feeling, like you're being watched. Not in a paranoid way, but more like there's something out there, keeping an eye on you, waiting. A few of the guys have said they've seen glimpses, a shadow moving between trees, a silhouette standing just beyond the campfire's glow. We don't really talk about it anymore, but I know I'm not the only one who remembers that night vividly. Even now, decades later, I can still picture that face, those eyes reflecting back at us. I've tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a bear or some kind of trick of the light. But deep down, I know what I saw wasn't anything like that. It was something else, something that shouldn't be there, and the way it looked at us, it felt almost like a warning, like we were lucky it decided we weren't worth the trouble. I'm not saying I believe in Bigfoot or whatever, but I know what I saw, and I know that feeling. That's not something you just shake off. So if you ever find yourself out in the woods near Elma and things start getting quiet, just trust me. Don't go looking for whatever's out there. Sometimes it's better to just let things be. I still get chills thinking about what happened back in the Cascade Mountains in 1997. I was just a teenager at the time, out hunting with my dad. It was one of those things we did every year, kind of a tradition. We were after bears that time, and we had our dogs with us, like always. Our dogs were well-trained and fearless. They'd bark at anything that moved. But that day, something wasn't right. I could feel it even before things got weird. We were a good 2 miles into the forest, deep enough that you couldn't hear a single sound from civilization. It was just the rustle of trees, the crunch of leaves underfoot, and the occasional bark from one of the dogs. They were sniffing around, doing their job, when suddenly they froze. Every single one of them stopped dead in their tracks, ears up, and then, without warning, they turned and bolted. These weren't just scared dogs, they were in full-on panic. I've never seen them move like that, tails tucked, sprinting back towards the truck like their lives depended on it. Dad and I just looked at each other, confused. I remember saying something like, "What the hell spooked them?" before we started following them back, trying to call them, but they were gone. That's when we heard it, this scream. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard before. It wasn't a bear, and it sure as hell wasn't a cougar. It was this deep, guttural howl that echoed through the trees, almost vibrating in my chest. I looked at my dad, and for the first time in my life, I saw fear in his eyes. He knew these mountains, and he knew the animals around here. Whatever that was, it wasn't something he recognized. We decided to head back. We weren't running, not yet, but we were moving with a purpose, trying to keep our cool. But every few steps we'd hear something, branches snapping, heavy footsteps keeping pace with us. It was like it was matching our movements, staying just out of sight. We'd stop, and it would stop. We'd move, and there it was again. At one point, my dad whispered, "Don't look back, just keep going." I swear those were the scariest words I'd ever heard him say. I felt my heart pounding, and it wasn't just from the walking. It was pure adrenaline, pure fear. Then it got worse. The noises weren't just behind us anymore. They were around us, to the left, to the right, even ahead at some point. It was like whatever this thing was, it was circling us, toying with us. I could hear something crashing through the underbrush, and then another sound from the opposite direction. It made no sense. How could one creature move so fast, or were there more of them? The thought made my stomach drop. My dad raised his rifle and fired a shot into the air, and for a moment, everything went dead silent. Not a sound. Even the forest seemed to be holding its breath. We didn't wait. We just kept moving, faster now, practically jogging through the thick woods. My dad fired another shot, and that's when we heard this low growl, like it was angry. I remember the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. It felt like whatever this was, it wasn't scared of us, and that terrified me. I think that was the moment I knew we had to get out of there no matter what. We finally broke through the tree line, and I could see the truck. The dogs were huddled by it, whining, and I've never been so happy to see those old mutts in my life. We jumped in, slammed the doors, and my dad didn't waste a second starting the engine. The dogs were shaking, panting hard, and I was trying to catch my breath too. As we sped down that dirt road, I looked back through the window, half expecting to see something bursting out of the woods after us, but there was nothing, just the trees, still and silent, like none of it had ever happened. My dad didn't say a word until we were halfway down the mountain. Then he just muttered, "That wasn't any damn bear." I didn't need him to say it. I knew that already. I've tried to make sense of it ever since. I've read about Bigfoot sightings, listened to stories, but nothing quite matches what we experienced. It wasn't just seeing something strange. It was the feeling of being hunted, of something intelligent out there that wanted us gone. I still have nightmares about it sometimes. I hear that scream in my dreams, and I wake up drenched in sweat, heart pounding. My dad never talked about it again, and I stopped asking. Some things I think are better left alone. To this day, I don't go back to those mountains. I know people say there's nothing out there, that it's all in our heads, but I felt it. I felt its presence, its anger, and that isn't something you just forget. I can still remember the way my dad's face looked, the fear in his eyes, the urgency in his voice. He wasn't scared of anything, but whatever we encountered that day, it shook him to his core. And if a man like my dad could be scared, then I know for damn sure it was something real. Sometimes I wonder if anyone else has experienced the same thing out there. Maybe it's just one of those places, a spot in the world where things aren't quite right, where the rules we know don't apply. I don't know. All I know is that we were lucky to get out of there, and I hope to God I never hear that scream again. My grandfather used to tell this story, always with that haunted look in his eyes, the kind that makes you wonder if someone is really remembering something or just stuck in a moment they wish they could forget. He was a train engineer back in the 1880s, and there was this one incident that he swore changed his life forever. Now, I know some people might call it a tall tale, but every time he told it, you could just see how real it was for him. He never tried to embellish it. He only ever spoke about it in that quiet, almost reluctant way, like he wished it had never happened. It happened while his train was making its way through an isolated stretch of the border between the US and Canada. It was one of those places where civilization just hadn't reached yet. Thick forests on either side, the kind of desolation that made you feel like the world had ended, and no one told you. He always said that the night was unnervingly quiet, except for the steady clack of the train wheels against the tracks. Then, out of nowhere, there was this loud, bone-jarring thud, the kind of impact that made the entire train shudder and almost come off the rails. He and the other workers thought maybe they'd hit a fallen tree or even a moose. It wasn't unheard of in those parts. But when they went out to inspect, It wasn't anything they'd expected. It was a creature, something huge, hairy, and unlike anything they had ever seen before. My grandfather said it looked like a giant ape, but not quite. It had these long, muscular limbs and a face that wasn't quite a gorilla's, more human-like, but still off, in a way he couldn't put into words. Its eyes were open but vacant, and the sheer size of it was staggering. It took all the workers to drag it off the tracks and onto a flat car so they could work on repairing the damage. The smell, he said, was almost unbearable. It was this mix of wet dog, rot, and something else, something he could never quite describe but said was enough to make a few of the men gag. The stench clung to their clothes and their skin like it was alive and refused to let go. They managed to get the creature onto the flat car, and that's when they really got a good look at it. It was covered in matted hair, thick and dark, but the skin underneath was this strange greyish colour, almost like it belonged to something that had never seen sunlight. They worked as fast as they could to fix the front of the train, but all the while they could feel this strange unease. It was like they were being watched. My grandfather said the forest around them had grown unnaturally still, the kind of silence that felt deliberate, like the whole world was holding its breath. One of the younger workers, a kid named Tommy, kept glancing nervously towards the tree line. He swore he saw shadows moving, figures slipping between the trees, but no one paid him much attention. They just wanted to get the train moving again. Once they finally got the train operational, they decided to keep the creature on the flat car. They weren't sure what else to do with it. There was no protocol for something like that. But as they were getting ready to leave, my grandfather said he heard something, a rustling from the forest, followed by what sounded like low, mournful howls. It wasn't a wolf, he said, and it wasn't anything he'd heard before. The other men heard it too, and there was this unspoken agreement among them not to talk about it, just to get back on the train and get the hell out of there. When they finally started moving, everyone seemed to relax a little. The tension eased, and there was even some nervous laughter, but that relief didn't last long. A few miles down the track, they stopped again to check on the flat car, and the creature was gone. Just gone. The chains they'd used to secure it were snapped, and there were these huge footprints leading away from the train, back towards the forest. The tracks were deep, like whatever had taken it was carrying a tremendous weight. They followed the prints for a bit, and that's when they saw them. A group of figures, just barely visible through the thick fog that had started rolling in. They were tall, almost as tall as the creature itself, and they moved with this eerie grace. My grandfather said they were wrapped in furs, but it was hard to tell where the fur ended and they began. They didn't look back, didn't acknowledge the men at all. They just disappeared into the trees, taking the creature with them. After that, the men decided it was best not to ask questions. They got back on the train and left as fast as they could. My grandfather said the smell lingered for days, though. No matter how much they washed, they couldn't get rid of it. It was like a reminder, a mark left on them by whatever it was they'd encountered. He took a few strands of the creature's hair, thinking maybe someone could figure out what it was. He gave it to a doctor he knew, but nothing ever came of it. The doctor said it didn't match anything he'd ever seen. Not a bear, not an ape, nothing. My grandfather never liked talking about it. He only told me because I pressed him, fascinated by the idea of what might be out there in those deep, forgotten woods. He always ended the story the same way, though, by saying that some things are better left alone. He believed that whatever they hit that night wasn't meant to be found, and that maybe, just maybe, they'd been lucky to get away with their lives. Even now, I can't shake the feeling his story gives me. It's that sense of something ancient, something that doesn't belong in our world, but is still out there, hidden in the shadows where no one dares to look. And every time I hear about someone going missing in the woods, I wonder if maybe they found what my grandfather did, or if it found them. I don't even know where to start, but I feel like I need to get this off my chest. It's been decades now, but the memories are still as clear as ever. It was the summer of 1976, and I had just moved out to Sheridan, Oregon with my husband. We'd finally found a place we could call our own, a secluded little farmhouse, miles away from the next neighbor, surrounded by thick forest. It was perfect for us. We loved the solitude, the quiet evenings, the stars that lit up the entire sky. But it didn't stay peaceful for long. The first time I saw it, it was late at night. My husband had already gone to bed, but I was sitting in the living room, just enjoying the sound of the crickets outside. Then I heard something, a noise I couldn't place, like heavy breathing mixed with a low growl. I thought it might have been an animal, maybe a bear. I got up, moved towards the kitchen, and that's when I saw it. A face, massive, right there at the window, peering in. My heart stopped. It wasn't a bear. Its eyes were too human-like, filled with an intelligence that frightened me more than anything else. I let out a scream, and the thing pulled back into the darkness. My husband rushed out, asking me what was wrong, but I couldn't even find the words to describe it. We went outside together, him with a flashlight, but there was nothing there, just the swaying of the trees and the night air, as if whatever I saw had melted back into the forest. He assured me it must have been an animal, maybe the shadows playing tricks, but I knew what I saw. The next day I tried to brush it off. I baked some bread, left it on the windowsill to cool, just to get my mind off things. But when I went back to get it, it was gone. I thought maybe an animal had gotten it, but then I noticed something odd. Right there on the windowsill where the bread had been were two smooth, flat stones, like they'd been placed there deliberately. It didn't make sense. I mentioned it to my husband, and he laughed it off, said I was overthinking things, but there was something about those stones. It felt like a trade. It didn't stop there. The face came back more than once. I'd be sitting in the living room at night, and I'd catch a glimpse of it from the corner of my eye, just standing there, staring. It never tried to break in, never made any noise beyond that strange breathing, just watched. My husband eventually saw it too, one night when he got up for water. He didn't laugh it off after that. We started noticing things missing, bread, apples from the tree out back, but then we'd find little things in return. More stones, carefully stacked twigs, a small bundle of dried leaves. It was unsettling, but there was something almost childlike about it, like it was trying to communicate. We began to see them more often, especially around dusk. Not just one, but sometimes two, maybe even three. Tall, broad-shouldered figures moving just beyond the tree line. We'd watch them, and they'd watch us. It was terrifying, but at the same time, there was a strange sort of understanding that seemed to form. They didn't want to harm us, at least that's what we kept telling ourselves. One night, we saw them in the yard, near the apple trees. There were two of them, one smaller than the other. The larger one was reaching up, plucking apples and handing them to the smaller one, who seemed almost playful. It was surreal. My husband and I just stood there, frozen in the kitchen, watching through the window. We didn't dare move, didn't dare breathe. It felt like we were intruding on something we weren't meant to see. After a while, we decided we couldn't just keep this to ourselves. My husband made some calls, and eventually we got in touch with some local authorities. They sent out a group of men, investigators they said, who set up camp on our property for several weeks. They had cameras, strange equipment, and they'd ask us all kinds of questions. We were hopeful at first, thinking they might figure out what these things were, maybe even catch one on camera. But after a few weeks, they packed up and left. One of the men pulled me aside before they left, told me it was best if we didn't talk about what we'd seen. He said it could cause a lot of unnecessary panic that people wouldn't understand. He had this look in his eyes, like he knew more than he was letting on. I didn't push it. We were already in over our heads. After that, things started to die down. We'd still see them every now and then, but they kept their distance. The gifts stopped, and so did the missing food. It was like they'd gotten what they wanted, whatever that was. To this day, I still don't know why they chose our place, or what they were after. I sometimes wonder if they were as curious about us as we were about them. It's been years since we moved away from that farmhouse. I still think about it sometimes, especially late at night when the house is quiet and the shadows start to play tricks. I've never been able to shake the feeling that they're still out there, somewhere in those woods, watching. I don't think I'll ever really understand what happened, and maybe that's for the best. But I'll never forget that face at the window, those eyes staring back at me from the darkness. It's something that stays with you, no matter how far you go. I don't really know how to start this, but I feel like I need to get it out there. It's been decades, but I still remember that night like it was yesterday. It was 1989, and I had this grand idea to spend 2 weeks alone in the forest. I needed a break, just to be away from people, clear my head and challenge myself a little. I had planned it all out, got all the supplies, a tent, food, and most importantly, my trusty lantern. I'm not exactly the survivalist type, but I thought I'd be fine. Spoiler alert, I wasn't. The first night, everything was okay at first. I had set up camp near a small clearing. There was something about the quiet of the forest that was both peaceful and a little eerie. No distant cars, no chatter, just me and nature. I cooked a quick meal, settled in, and decided to read for a while before bed. That's when things took a turn. My lantern, the only real source of light I had, just died. No flicker, no warning. It just went out completely. I was left there in total darkness. I tried not to panic, but it was impossible not to feel that knot tighten in my stomach. I figured I could manage through the night. I crawled into my sleeping bag, tried to keep calm, and convinced myself that I'd figure it all out in the morning. I've never felt time pass so slowly as it did in that darkness. Every little rustle from the trees made me jump, and every gust of wind sounded like something moving through the woods. At some point, I must have fallen asleep, because the next thing I remember is waking up to the early light filtering through the branches. It felt like I had barely slept at all. I got up and decided to explore a bit around my campsite. That's when I found them. The footprints. Massive, like something out of a movie, but they were real. I could see every detail, the toes, the depth of the prints. And it wasn't just one set. There were 3 different trails, crisscrossing the clearing like they had been walking around all night. My first thought was that it had to be a prank, but I was miles away from anyone. There wasn't a soul around for at least 20 miles as far as I knew. I couldn't let it go. I know it sounds crazy, but something inside me told me to stick around, to find out more. I spent the entire day building a makeshift cabin, something solid that would keep me covered, but with a small opening so I could observe the clearing. I thought if whatever it was came back, I'd be ready this time. I'd see it with my own eyes. The day went by in a blur of chopping wood and hammering branches together, and by the time night came, I was both exhausted and running on pure adrenaline. As the sun went down, I settled inside my little makeshift shelter. I don't know if you've ever been out in the woods at night without a light, but there's nothing quite like it. It's like the darkness swallows everything. I was sitting there, staring out at the clearing, trying to keep my eyes adjusted to the dark. I kept telling myself I was imagining things, that maybe I was making a big deal out of some bear tracks or something, but deep down, I knew. Those weren't bear tracks. It must have been around 2 in the morning when I first heard it. Heavy footsteps coming from somewhere deep in the trees. It wasn't the sound of a deer or a bear. It was heavier, slower, and then I saw them. 3 silhouettes, just barely visible against the darker outline of the forest. They were big, taller than any man I'd ever seen, and they moved slowly, deliberately towards the clearing. My heart was pounding so hard, I was sure they'd hear it. They stopped, right there, at the edge of the clearing. I could see their outlines, broad shoulders, long arms that hung down low. I wanted to move, to grab my camera, to do something, but I was frozen. I've never felt fear like that in my entire life. They just stood there, like they were looking at my campsite. Or maybe they knew I was there. The air felt thick, like even breathing was hard. I was too scared to even blink, afraid that if I moved, they'd notice me. I don't know how long they stood there. It felt like hours, but it was probably just a few minutes. Eventually, they turned and walked back into the woods, disappearing into the dark as silently as they had come. I didn't move until the first light of dawn started to break. I was stiff, my muscles sore from staying so still all night. I crawled out of my shelter and walked over to where they had stood. The ground was covered in fresh footprints, overlapping with the ones from the night before. I can't really explain the feeling I had at that moment. It was a mix of awe and absolute terror. Whatever they were real. I packed up my things as quickly as I could. I wanted to get out of there, but part of me felt like I was leaving something unfinished. I knew I'd never get those answers if I left, but I also knew I couldn't stay another night. Not after what I had seen. I spent years after that night trying to make sense of it. I started reading everything I could about Bigfoot sightings, talking to people who'd had similar experiences. Most of them described the same thing, that feeling of being watched, the heavy footsteps, the sheer size of these things. It was comforting, in a strange way, knowing I wasn't alone in what I'd seen. But it also made it scarier, because it meant that whatever these things are, they're out there, and they're real. I've gone back to the woods a few times since then, but never alone. I don't think I could handle that kind of fear again. Sometimes I wonder if I'd see them again if I went back to that same spot. But part of me knows that I'm better off not knowing. That night in 1989 changed everything for me. I went into the woods looking for peace and ended up finding something I can't ever really explain. To this day, I still don't know what they were, but I know they were there, and I know I'll never forget it. I know a lot of people won't believe this, and frankly, if I were you, I'd have my doubts too. But I can't forget that night, and to this day, when I close my eyes, it's as if I'm still there, in that old cabin in the mountains. I'm going to tell you what happened, because I think that somehow getting it off my chest can help me deal with the fear I still feel. The idea seemed good at the time. I wanted to get out of the city, breathe fresh air, and have a solo adventure. So I packed my bags and decided to explore a mountain trail I'd heard about. The journey was long and tiring, and just as it was starting to get dark, I came across an abandoned hut. It didn't look like the coziest place in the world, but it was getting dark, and I didn't want to pitch my tent in the middle of nowhere. I entered the hut, and it looked like it hadn't been used in decades. Dust, broken furniture, and a strange atmosphere of abandonment. Everything went smoothly until about 3 a.m. I was about to doze off, curled up in my sleeping bag, when I heard the first sound. Heavy footsteps outside, slow, as if something was walking leisurely around the hut. I froze. The noise was distinctive, the sound of something really big stepping on dry leaves. My heart started racing, and I forced myself to stay silent, trying to hear better. At first, I thought it might be a deer or some large animal, but those footsteps, they were different. There was a weight there, something that made my instinct scream that this was not just an ordinary animal. After the footsteps, I heard something scratching the walls of the hut. It was a low, continuous sound, as if long nails were sliding across the old wood. I couldn't see anything from where I was, but the sound was moving, all the way around the outside of the hut. With each scratch, the feeling of being watched grew. I grabbed my knife, the only thing I had to defend myself, and sat there, my heart racing and sweat dripping down my back, even in the cold of the early morning. There was a moment when the noise stopped, and the silence that followed was even worse. I didn't know if it had gone away, or if it was just standing there waiting. Courage, or perhaps curiosity, took hold of me, and I crawled to the window to try and see what was going on outside. That's when I saw it. Between the trees, there was a tall figure, maybe 2 meters, completely covered in dark hair. I couldn't see its face clearly, but I could swear that its eyes were glowing in the darkness, fixed on the hut. My stomach churned at that moment. It wasn't a bear, it wasn't any animal I'd ever seen before. It was just standing there, watching. I moved away from the window as quickly as I could, trying not to make a sound. I cowered in the far corner of the hut, holding the knife tightly, as if it could protect me from something so big. My hands were shaking, and I felt every second pass as if it were an eternity. The thing kept circling the hut for hours. Sometimes I would hear footsteps coming closer, sometimes a scratching on the wall, and then silence would return. I didn't dare look out of the window again. I stood there motionless, waiting, praying that it would go away and leave me alone. I no longer knew if it was real or if my mind was playing tricks on me, but the fear was very palpable. Every crack of the old wood made my whole body stiffen. The night seemed endless. I was counting the minutes until dawn, and every time a branch broke outside, I felt like it could be the end. I remember starting to think about my family, about what a bad idea it had been to come here alone. It was as if I could feel the presence of that thing, even without seeing it, just waiting for the right moment to do something. Finally, When the first rays of sunlight began to come through the cracks in the hut, the noise stopped. The silence outside was different this time, almost as if the place was empty again. I waited a little longer until I was sure it was light enough, and then slowly stood up. I looked out of the window cautiously, and there was no sign of the creature, just the silence of the forest and the overwhelming relief that perhaps I had survived it. I left the hut as quickly as I could, still holding the knife, even though I knew that if it came back, the knife wouldn't make any difference. As soon as I came around the hut, I saw the footprints. They were huge, deep, as if something incredibly heavy had been walking there all night. They weren't bear tracks, and they definitely weren't human. The sight of those marks on the ground made my head spin. It wasn't a dream. It had really happened. I wasted no time. I grabbed my things and headed down the trail as fast as I could, all the while looking over my shoulder, hoping to see that figure among the trees again. I just wanted to get out of there, back to civilization, away from whatever it was. When I finally reached the spot where my car was parked, I felt such relief that I almost cried. I got into the car and drove off without looking back. To this day, I can't explain what it was like. I've read a lot about encounters with strange creatures. I've seen people talking about Bigfoot and other things, but nothing compares to the fear of actually being there, alone, in the middle of the forest, with something watching you. Since then, I've never been back to those mountains, and frankly, I don't even want to. I don't know what was watching me that night, but I do know that I'll never forget the look in that thing's eyes in the darkness. Maybe I'll never find out what it was, and maybe that's for the best. Just thinking about that night makes my hair stand on end and my heart race. Whatever it was, I hope I never come across it again. If anyone here has been through something similar, I'd love to know. Because honestly, I still wonder if it really happened, or if my mind just couldn't handle the isolation and fear. But those footprints, those damn footprints were real. Wow. I'm not the type to believe in supernatural things, and frankly, I've never been impressed by stories of monsters or strange creatures. But what happened to me and my wife that night, on a deserted country road, was different. And I need to share it with you here, because I'm still trying to understand what we saw. It was a Saturday, and we were on our way back from a friend's house after a small party. It was late, probably around 2 in the morning, and we took that country road to cut through and get home faster. The road was typical of these rural roads, nothing but trees on either side, no streetlights, and a feeling of total isolation. I was driving while my wife was on her cell phone. The radio was off because we had argued earlier, and the atmosphere was still a bit tense. Then, without warning, the car started to fail. I thought it was just an engine hiccup, but seconds later the car completely died. No response. We stood there, in the middle of the darkness, in what seemed like the most isolated place in the world. I tried to stay calm and told my wife that it was probably just a problem with the battery. I took the flashlight from the glove compartment and went out to have a look at the engine. My wife stayed inside the car, illuminating the vehicle's manual with the light from her cell phone, trying to see if she could find any tips. I was outside, fiddling with the cables, when I heard a noise coming from the trees, something like the sound of branches breaking. I thought it was a deer or something because, we're in the middle of nowhere, and these animals always appear out of nowhere. That's when my wife started banging on the car window frantically. I looked at her and saw her pale face pointing at something in the direction of the forest, a little further away. I turned the flashlight to where she was pointing, and for a second saw nothing. But then something moved. A huge figure, half hidden among the trees, as if it were watching us. It was tall, much taller than any man I'd ever seen, and covered in a dark coat. I couldn't see any details of its face, but I had the distinct feeling that it was staring at us. My heart raced, and without a second thought, I ran back to the car. I locked the door, and my wife had already done the same on her side. We stood there, trying to control our breathing and understand what was happening. The figure was still there, half hidden, and from time to time you could see the movement of the trees around it, as if it was getting closer, one step at a time. It was as if it was testing us, seeing what we would do. We couldn't see properly. The light from the flashlight didn't reach very far, but the silhouette was clear. It was huge, robust, and moved with an eerie calm. My wife started whispering that we should call the tow truck. I took out my cell phone, my hands shaking so much that I almost couldn't type in the number. While I was talking to the attendant, my eyes kept moving in that direction, trying to maintain eye contact with the thing in case it decided to get even closer. I think we stood there for about 40 minutes, which seemed like an eternity. The creature didn't come any closer, but it didn't leave either. It stayed there, between the trees, as if it were watching us. My wife couldn't stop crying quietly, and I didn't know what to do to comfort her. All I could think was that we needed to stay in the car and wait. Finally, we spotted the lights of the tow truck in the distance, and that's when the figure seemed to move back into the darkness, disappearing between the trees. The tow truck driver arrived, and I've never been so happy to see another person in my life. He got off the truck, pointed his flashlight at the car, and immediately noticed something on the ground. He asked if we had seen any bears there, and I denied it. It was then that he drew our attention to the footprints around the car. They were huge, much bigger than any human footprint, and had a strange shape, as if they were those of a bipedal animal. The driver looked confused, but didn't ask any more questions, perhaps realizing that we were already scared enough. We didn't say much on the way back. My wife and I sat in silence, trying to process what had happened. When we finally got home, we locked all the doors and windows, even though we knew it was irrational. But the feeling of being watched never left my mind. That night, we couldn't sleep. Every little noise sounded like a warning. Every shadow on the window made me hold my breath. What bothers me most to this day is that I can't explain what we saw. I don't believe in monsters, I don't believe in legends, but those footprints, that figure, everything seemed so real. And if it was just our imagination playing tricks, then how can we explain the marks on the ground? How to explain the visceral fear I felt at that moment? My wife also avoids talking about it. Every time I bring it up, she just changes the subject, as if she'd rather forget it ever happened. But I can't forget. Every time I take a deserted road at night, I remember that feeling, that silent presence, almost waiting to take the next step. And somehow I feel that if I tell this story here, maybe someone else has already experienced something similar and can help me understand. Because honestly, I still don't know what that was, and maybe I never will. So, I've never really been the type of person who believes in cryptids or those stories about weird creatures lurking in the woods. I've always thought that stuff was just for the internet or late-night campfire tales. But what happened to me and my friends last summer changed everything. I honestly still get chills just thinking about it, and I've been wanting to share it here, maybe because I know you all will actually believe me, unlike most people I try to tell. It was supposed to be a chill weekend, just a few of us camping out at this national park, getting away from the city noise. There were 4 of us, me, Mike, Jenna, and Alex. We set up camp not too far from the main trail, but far enough that we'd have some peace and quiet. The first day was totally normal. We hiked, cooked some hot dogs over the fire, and shared some beers while laughing at stupid jokes. Everything felt perfect. I remember the sky being so clear, and the stars were the brightest I'd ever seen. It was around 1 a.m. when we all finally decided to crash in our tent. I don't know how long I was asleep before I heard it. This scream, I'm telling you, it was unlike anything I've ever heard in my life. It was high-pitched, like a woman's scream, but deeper, almost guttural. It echoed through the forest, and I remember waking up instantly, heart pounding, not sure if I was still dreaming. But then I heard it again, and I realized that Jenna, who was next to me, had woken up too. We exchanged this look in the dark, eyes wide, like, "Did you hear that too?" Before I could say anything, Mike unzipped the tent, and we all stumbled out into the cold night air. The fire had mostly died down, just glowing embers, and everything was dark and quiet. Too quiet. That's the part that sticks with me. There were no sounds of insects, no rustling of leaves, nothing. Just this heavy, oppressive silence. We stood there, shivering, straining our ears, and then that scream again. This time it sounded like it was closer. It made my stomach drop. Mike grabbed his flashlight and we all did the same, sweeping the beams through the woods. But we didn't see anything. just endless trees and shadows that seemed to move if you looked at them for too long. I could feel my skin prickling, every hair on my body standing up. It wasn't just fear. It was like something in my gut was telling me we shouldn't be there. Alex whispered, "Maybe it's an animal." But his voice was shaky, and I could tell he didn't believe that any more than the rest of us did. Eventually, after what felt like forever, the screams stopped. We stood out there, frozen, for a while longer, waiting to hear anything else. Nothing. Finally, Jenna suggested we just go back in the tent and try to sleep, though none of us were really sure we'd be able to. We crawled back in, zipped up, and just lay there, wide awake, listening. I swear, every creak of a branch or rustle of leaves outside had my heart pounding out of my chest. When morning finally came, we all looked like hell. Barely any of us had slept. We decided to pack up early, and as we were getting things together, Mike suddenly called us over, his voice tense. I walked over to where he was standing, and that's when I saw it. The trees. They were snapped. Not just branches, but entire trunks, twisted and broken, like they were nothing more than twigs. And there were these deep, long gouges in the bark, like something big, had clawed at them. It didn't make any sense. No animal I know of could do that. The marks were at least 7 feet up, way too high for any bear, and they were so deep. It looked like whatever did it was incredibly strong. My stomach turned as I looked around, realizing these weren't just random trees either. They were all close to our campsite, like something had been circling us. We decided to call the park office, and eventually a guide came by to check things out. He was this older guy, looked like he'd seen it all. But when he saw the broken trees and the claw marks, his face changed. He didn't say much, just kept looking around. And I remember him muttering something about stories people tell, but that he'd never seen it this close. When Alex pressed him on it, he just shook his head and told us it'd be best if we packed up and left. We didn't need to be told twice. The entire hike back to the car was tense. None of us spoke much, and every sound, every crack of a branch, every rustle had me on edge. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see, I don't even know what. Something huge, something that shouldn't exist. Even now, I'm not sure what we heard or what was out there, but I know it wasn't just an animal. Since then, none of us really talk about it. I tried bringing it up once with Mike, just to see if he remembered it the same way I did, but he brushed it off, said it was probably just some weird echo or animal we weren't familiar with. But I know he's lying. I could see it in his eyes that day. We all felt it. That raw, primal fear, like something was out there watching us, something that wanted us gone. I don't go camping anymore. I've always loved the outdoors, but now, just the thought of being out in the woods at night makes my skin crawl. I still hear that scream in my dreams sometimes, that deep, guttural wail that felt like it was tearing through the night. I don't know what it was, but whatever it was real, and it wanted us to know it was there. I don't really know how to start this without sounding completely insane, but here it goes. It all happened a couple of months back in the dead of winter. I live in a rural area, miles away from the nearest neighbor, so it's just me, my dog Buddy, and a couple of chickens. I'm used to the isolation. I usually enjoy the peace, you know? But that night, everything changed. I remember it was around 2 a.m. when I woke up. Something felt off, and the silence outside was heavy. It wasn't normal. Usually I could hear the occasional rustling or at least the wind in the trees. But that night, it was like the world had gone on mute. Then I realized Buddy wasn't in the room. He always sleeps right by my bed, and when I didn't hear his breathing, I knew something was wrong. I called out for him, but there was nothing. I grabbed a flashlight and went outside, just to make sure he wasn't in the yard. The cold air hit me like a wall, and I remember feeling this creeping sense of unease. I kept calling his name, my voice carrying into the night. That's when I heard it, a muffled bark coming from the woods. It sounded distant, like he was deep in there, somewhere he shouldn't have been. Buddy's an adventurous dog, always sniffing around and getting into places, but he'd never gone into the forest at night. I hesitated for a second, but I couldn't just leave him out there. So I slipped on my boots, pulled my jacket tight, and headed towards the sound. It was weird. The closer I got to the woods, the heavier the air felt. There was a strange pressure, almost like the forest itself was pushing back against me. I followed Buddy's barking for what felt like forever, stumbling through brush and getting smacked in the face by low branches. Then suddenly, the barking stopped. Dead silence again. My flashlight flickered, and that's when I caught a whiff of it. A smell so rancid and sharp that it made me gag. It was like something had died and was left to rot, but worse, almost chemical in a way. I kept moving, holding my breath to avoid the stench. The ground was littered with broken branches, and the trees around me seemed like they had been snapped in half, not just by wind, but like something massive had forced its way through. Then I saw Buddy. He was standing there, frozen, looking at something just beyond my light's reach. His ears were pinned back, and he had his tail between his legs. I've never seen him look so terrified. I shined my flashlight in the direction he was staring, and that's when I saw it. A shadow, a huge towering shadow that moved quickly, almost gliding between the trees. It was definitely on two legs, and it was massive, bigger than any human I've ever seen. My breath caught in my throat, and I swear for a second it felt like the thing was looking right at me. I couldn't see any details, just the silhouette, but there was this overwhelming feeling that I wasn't supposed to be there, like I'd walked into something's territory. Buddy let out a whimper, and before I even realized it, he bolted back towards the house. I didn't waste any time either. I turned and ran, branches snapping under my boots, heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. The whole time I felt like something was right behind me, just out of sight, moving silently through the darkness. I kept expecting to feel a hand, or something worse, grab me from behind. When we finally made it back to the house, I slammed the door shut and locked it, every bolt, every latch. Buddy was shaking, his eyes wide, and he wouldn't leave my side. There was this overwhelming sense of dread, like whatever I saw was still out there watching. I could still smell that rancid stench clinging to my clothes. I tried to calm myself down, telling myself it was just a bear, maybe even some prankster. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat in the living room with Buddy curled up at my feet, the shotgun across my lap. Every little sound made me jump, the creak of the floorboards, the wind against the window. I kept thinking about the way those branches were broken, the size of that shadow, the feeling of being watched. It's hard to describe, but it was like I was nothing, just prey. The next morning, when the sun finally came up, I went back outside to check around. The forest edge looked normal, but when I went in a little deeper, I saw the broken branches, the path that had been cleared like something huge had forced its way through. The smell was gone, but the feeling wasn't. It felt like the forest had eyes, like every step I took was being tracked. Since that night, Buddy refuses to go anywhere near the woods. He'll bark at the edge but won't set a paw past it, even during the day. I can't say I blame him. I've stopped going for walks in there too. There's just this sense that whatever I saw is still out there, lurking, waiting. I've tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just my imagination. Maybe I was half asleep. But then I think about Buddy's reaction, the way he bolted, the fear in his eyes. Dogs don't imagine things like that. I haven't seen it since, and part of me hopes I never do. But another part of me, the part that's still terrified, wonders if it's still watching, just beyond the tree line. Sometimes at night, I'll hear something moving out there, and I'll feel that same heavy pressure, that silence that isn't quite right. I don't know what I saw that night, but I'm convinced it wasn't an animal, at least not one I've ever heard of. I just wanted to share this here because I know some of you have had experiences like this. Things you can't explain, things that make you question everything you thought you knew about what's out there. I still don't have answers, and maybe I never will. But if you ever hear your dog barking at something deep in the woods in the middle of the night, maybe just let it be. It all started like a typical Tuesday night shift. I was working security at this industrial complex, a place right on the edge of a thick forest. Honestly, most nights are pretty boring. I just drive around in my patrol car, keeping an eye out for anything suspicious. It's mostly quiet. But something about that night felt off. There was this weird heaviness in the air that I just couldn't shake. I shrugged it off at first, thinking I was just tired or maybe letting my imagination get the best of me. Around midnight, I was making my rounds, slowly driving along the perimeter of the property. There's a section that runs pretty close to the tree line, and it always gives me the creeps, even on a good day. The forest is so dense that it's like staring into a black void, and on that particular night, it seemed darker than usual. As I passed that section, I heard something, this deep, almost guttural noise coming from the woods. It wasn't like anything I'd heard before. It wasn't a coyote, and it definitely wasn't a deer. It sounded heavy, like something massive was moving through the brush. I stopped the car and rolled down the window, trying to get a better listen. The noise stopped, and there was just silence. Not even the usual rustling of leaves or chirping of crickets. It was so quiet it made my skin crawl. I'm not gonna lie, my instincts were telling me to get the hell out of there. But I was also curious. I figured it might be a bear, so I pulled out my flashlight, aimed it towards the tree line, and scanned the area. Nothing. Just darkness. I decided to keep going, but as I started driving away, my radio crackled. The security cameras had picked up some motion near the back end of the property, close to where I just was. I parked and pulled up the camera feed on my tablet. At first, I didn't see much, just the usual static and grainy footage. But then, there it was. A huge dark figure moved across the screen, just for a split second. It was fast, but not in a way that a human or even a bear would be. It was tall, broad, and covered in what looked like fur. My heart just about stopped. I rewound the footage, trying to get a better look, but the camera quality was crap, and it was hard to make out any details. All I knew was that whatever it was big, way bigger than any person. I started to feel this sense of dread. My gut was screaming at me that something was very wrong. I didn't want to go back out there, but I had to at least check the perimeter fence. It's protocol, you know? So, I drove around, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles were turning white. When I reached the far corner of the property, I saw it. The fence was mangled, not just cut or bent, but completely torn apart, like something had barreled right through it. And just beyond the fence, I could see the trees. Several of them were snapped, not just branches, but entire trunks splintered like toothpicks. That's when the fear really hit me. Whatever I'd seen on that camera wasn't just passing through. It was strong enough to tear through metal and snap trees like they were nothing. I felt this wave of panic. I didn't want to be out there anymore. I reversed, almost slamming into a post in my hurry to get away, and drove straight back to the small building where we keep the monitors and logbooks. I parked the car and locked the doors. I wasn't about to step foot outside again that night. I spent the next few hours just sitting there, staring at the camera feeds, jumping at every little movement. My eyes were glued to the screen, but whatever it was, it didn't come back. I kept telling myself it was probably just an animal, maybe a trick of the light, but deep down I knew that wasn't true. The way it moved, the sheer size of it. I've never seen anything like it. I was counting down the minutes until my shift ended, praying nothing else would happen. When morning finally came, I went straight to my supervisor to report what I had seen. I showed him the footage, explained about the fence, the trees, everything. He just looked at me, this bored expression on his face, and said, "Don't worry about it. These things happen out here. Best not to pay too much attention." I couldn't believe it. It was like he'd heard it all before and just didn't care. He told me to file a basic report and leave it at that. The nonchalance in his voice made my skin crawl even more. It was like he knew something that I didn't, like this wasn't the first time something like this had happened. I wanted to press him, to ask more questions, but the look he gave me made it clear that the conversation was over. Just forget about it. Pretend it never happened. That's what he wanted. I finished my shift, went home, and tried to get some sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw that figure moving across the camera feed. I kept thinking about the sound I heard, that deep, guttural noise, and the way the trees were snapped like twigs. It didn't feel real, but I knew it was. I could still feel that fear, that primal instinct telling me I was in danger. I haven't been back to work since. I called in sick for a few days, and I'm honestly thinking about quitting. Whatever is out there, I don't want to be anywhere near it. And the fact that my supervisors just brushed it off like it was nothing, that's what scares me the most. It makes me think they know exactly what's out there, and they've just accepted it. like it's part of the job. I've been trying to make sense of it, but I can't. I even looked up wildlife in the area, trying to convince myself it was just a bear or some other animal, but nothing matches what I saw. Nothing moves like that. Nothing has that kind of strength. I don't know what it was, and I'm not sure I want to know. All I know is that I'm not going back there. Whatever's in those woods can have that place. I'm done. To this day, I still get chills thinking about it. Sometimes, late at night, I'll hear a noise outside my window, and my heart will skip a beat, that same dread washing over me. I'll never forget that feeling, the absolute certainty that I was being watched by something that shouldn't exist. And the worst part is, I'll probably never get any answers. It's just something I have to live with now. I never thought I'd be here writing this. In fact, I've never been the kind of person who believes in supernatural things or strange creatures. But what's happened in my garden over the last few weeks has left me at a loss for an explanation, and to be honest, pretty scared. It all started in a rather banal, almost comical way, but quickly turned into something that makes me rethink whether I'm really safe in my own home. The first time I noticed something amiss was one Wednesday morning. I was leaving for work and realized that some of my plant pots were on the ground, broken. I thought it might be the wind or maybe a stray dog that had jumped the fence, the kind of thing that doesn't make you think twice. But the next night, the same thing happened. This time, there was also a horrible smell hanging around the balcony, something between carrion and urine, as if something had died there and rotted. I got angry, thinking it might be a skunk or some wild animal. But the following nights brought more than just broken pots. Smaller frogs from the trees in the garden were falling, and I began to notice strange marks on the ground, something that seemed to be made by some creature that walked on two legs, but not exactly human. Still, I couldn't convince myself that this was anything out of the ordinary. My mind tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a strange person coming into my yard, some bored teenager, or an animal I couldn't identify. After about 4 nights, I'd had enough. I decided to install security cameras. It wasn't anything fancy, just a couple of cameras on the balcony and a few pointing at the busiest corners of the garden. I did this on a Saturday morning, hoping to finally catch whatever it was in the act and resolve this uncomfortable situation. That night, I went to bed feeling a strange mixture of anxiety and excitement. Part of me wanted nothing to happen, but another part was ready to solve the mystery. The next morning, I went straight to reviewing the images. What I saw still gives me goosebumps, even weeks later. In the middle of the night, around 2:30 a.m., I noticed a bipedal figure crossing my yard, right on the side of the house. It wasn't a person. It was tall, covered in dark hair, and had a strange way of moving, as if each step was calculated, but also clumsy, as if it wasn't used to walking in such a restricted space as a yard. It passed quickly, almost disappearing into the dark, but it was enough to make me freeze in front of my computer screen. My heart raced. I reviewed the images 20 times, trying to understand what exactly I was seeing. The only thing I could think was, this is not normal. I didn't tell anyone, not even my wife. Do you know when something seems so out of touch with reality that you're afraid others will think you're going crazy? Well, that's exactly how I felt. And to be honest, I didn't want to hear people laughing or trying to convince me that I was exaggerating. That night, I decided to leave the garden light on. I've never been afraid of the dark, but after what I'd seen, the darkness of my own garden seemed to hide things I didn't want to face again. Funnily enough, it worked. Visits to the garden decreased, and the pot stopped being knocked over. That unbearable smell also dissipated. It was as if the light had driven the thing away, whatever it was, but the discomfort remained. Every night, I found myself looking out of the window, hoping to see some movement in the gloom. The mere knowledge that something so strange had been there, so close, took my sleep away. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, even if nothing else was out of place. I even considered selling the house, but it seemed far-fetched. Who would believe me? Worst of all was one night in particular, a couple of weeks after installing the cameras. I was asleep when I woke up to a noise that sounded like a growl, something low and guttural, coming from the garden. I was paralyzed, not knowing what to do. My wife was still asleep next to me, and I simply couldn't move. I didn't have the courage to go to the window and look, so I just lay there listening, while the sound became more and more distant, until it disappeared. The next morning, there was nothing out of place. No broken vases, no trees with fallen branches, nothing. I thought I might have been dreaming, but something deep inside me knew better. When I looked at the cameras, they hadn't picked up anything. No movement, no sound. This upset me even more. It was as if it was only in my head, but so real that I could feel the fear on my skin. Since then, everything seems to have returned to normal, but I can no longer feel my house in the same way. The garden, which used to be my favorite place, now seems charged with something I can't explain. I no longer see signs or hear noises, but the feeling of unease is constant, as if something was just waiting for the right moment to return. I don't know what it was. I don't have a rational explanation or a story full of details to give. All I know is that something was in my garden, something that shouldn't have been there. And even without any more evidence, the memory of that hairy figure crossing my yard in the middle of the night is something I'll never be able to get out of my mind. For now, I'm keeping the lights on and hoping it's enough. If this has ever happened to anyone else, I'd like to know, because it's horrible to go through this alone. Maybe it's better never to know what it really was, but curiosity and fear go hand in hand, and it's hard to just let it go. So, I'm not usually the kind of person who posts stuff like this, but what happened to me and my friends during our climbing trip last year has been haunting me ever since. I figured I'd share it here since you all might understand. Just thinking back on it makes me feel that same creeping unease all over again. Maybe writing it down will help me get it off my chest. Or maybe it'll just convince me even more that there's something out there that we were never meant to find. We'd planned this trip for months. We wanted something off the beaten path, somewhere that didn't have tourists swarming around. We'd heard about this particular mountain from a local guide we met on another hike. He said there were tons of unmapped caves, and most people stayed away because the terrain was tricky and a bit sketchy. It sounded perfect, a real adventure, something different. So, we packed up our gear and drove out there. There were 4 of us, me, my buddy Chris, his girlfriend Jen, and our friend Mark. We were ready for a weekend of pushing our limits. The first day went great. The place was gorgeous, untouched, and we didn't see a soul. We set up camp near one of the cave entrances we'd spotted on the way up. It was this gaping black hole in the rock face, big enough for 2 people to walk into side by side, and it gave off a weird vibe right away. I remember Jen making a joke about it being a perfect spot for a bear to live, and we all laughed it off, but there was something about it that just made me uneasy. It felt wrong somehow. But hey, we were there for adventure, right? That night, we were all sitting around the campfire, just talking and winding down after a long day of climbing. Everything was normal, until we started hearing these noises. At first it was faint, like distant rocks shifting. We figured it was just the wind, or maybe some loose stones falling somewhere. But then it got louder, like something, or someone, was deliberately moving rocks around, almost like dragging them. It was coming from the direction of the cave. Chris tried to shrug it off, saying it was probably just the mountain settling, but none of us really bought it. There was a weight to those sounds, a deep, deliberate heaviness that didn't feel natural. The weirdest part was this low, guttural sound we heard after the rocks. It almost sounded like a moan or a groan, but not human. It was deep, vibrating through the ground beneath us. I could feel it in my chest. We all went dead quiet, just listening. Jen looked at me, her eyes wide, and I knew she was just as freaked out as I was. I could tell Chris and Mark were trying to stay calm, but there was no mistaking the tension in the air. We decided to turn in early, mostly just to get out of the open. I won't lie, I barely slept that night. Every tiny noise had me on edge, listening for that sound again. When morning finally came, I felt this overwhelming sense of relief. I wanted to pack up and leave right away, and I think everyone else did too, though no one wanted to say it out loud. We started gathering our stuff, and that's when Mark noticed the footprints. They were huge, like nothing I'd ever seen before. Each one was at least twice the size of my boot, deep impressions in the dirt, and they circled around the entrance of the cave like something had been pacing back and forth. The strangest part was how clear they were. You could see the outline of toes, and the depth made it obvious that whatever made them was heavy, really heavy. Jen pointed out that there were no other tracks leading to or away from the cave, just these massive prints that seemed to start and end right at the entrance. It didn't make any sense. We all stood there for a while, just staring at them. I think we were all waiting for someone to suggest going inside to see if there was anything there, but none of us said a word. The cave mouth looked darker than before, like it was swallowing the light, and the idea of stepping inside just felt wrong, like we'd be crossing a line we shouldn't. Chris finally broke the silence, saying we should just get going, and no one argued. We packed up fast, faster than I think we ever have before. There was this growing sense that we weren't alone, that something was watching us. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see something emerge from that cave, some dark shape moving against the rock. My heart was pounding the whole time, and I could see Mark's hands shaking as he rolled up his sleeping bag. None of us talked much while we packed. We just wanted to get out of there. The hike back down felt way longer than it should have. Every snap of a twig, every rustle in the bushes made me jump. I'm not normally a nervous person, but that day I was on edge the entire time. I think we all were. We didn't stop until we were back at the car, and even then, it felt like we were being watched, like there were eyes on us from somewhere up the mountain. It wasn't until we were driving away that I finally started to relax, but even now, thinking about it gives me chills. We've talked about it a few times since then, but none of us can really explain what happened. Chris still tries to rationalize it. He says it was probably just an animal, maybe a bear, but I know he doesn't really believe that, not with those footprints. Jen refuses to even talk about it. She says it makes her too uneasy, like just remembering it will somehow bring it back. Mark, well, he's the only one who suggested maybe we go back someday, just to see if we could figure it out. But honestly, there's no way I'm setting foot on that mountain again. I don't know what we heard that night or what made those prints, but I do know one thing. It wasn't something any of us were prepared to find. There's something on that mountain, something that's better left alone. I still get this feeling sometimes late at night, like I'm back there sitting by that campfire, listening to those rocks being moved, feeling that deep, bone-chilling groan echoing through me. And I can't help but wonder if maybe, just maybe, we weren't supposed to be there at all. Thanks for listening, guys. I don't know if anyone else has experienced something like this, but if you have, I'd love to hear about it. It'd be nice to know we're not the only ones who felt whatever that was. Stay safe out there.
So, last weekend, I decided to take my drone out for a hike. I'm an amateur photographer, and I like to explore off-the-beaten-path locations, especially those deep in the forest where not many people go. It was one of those crisp, quiet afternoons, and I figured it would be perfect to get some cool aerial shots. I drove out to this secluded spot about an hour away from where I live, parked the car, and hiked for a bit until I found a clearing that seemed good for launching the drone. Everything felt normal at first. The forest was peaceful, just the rustling of leaves and distant bird calls. I set up my drone and sent it up, focusing on some of the rock formations and tree canopies that were too far or dangerous for me to reach on foot. I was in my own little world, concentrating on maneuvering the drone smoothly, getting shots of the sunlight filtering through the treetops. At one point, I noticed something odd on my screen, just a glimpse of something dark between the trees, almost blending in with the shadows. I didn't think much of it at first. Honestly, I figured it was just a trick of the light or maybe a large branch. But the more I flew around, the more I noticed it. This dark shape was moving, not in a rushed way, more like it was pacing or shifting slowly, as if it was trying to stay hidden while keeping an eye on the drone. I remember feeling a strange sensation, like a chill creeping up the back of my neck. It was subtle, but enough to make me zoom in for a closer look. The first thing that hit me was how tall it was. Whatever it was, it had a human-like shape, but much bigger. It stood upright, and I could see what looked like long, muscular arms hanging at its sides. The whole thing was covered in dark, matted hair. It didn't look like a bear. I've seen bears, and this thing had a posture that was almost too deliberate.
like it was aware of what it was doing, aware of me. For a few moments I just watched it through the drone's camera, frozen. I wasn't sure if I should bring the drone closer or pull it away. My heart was pounding, and I started to feel this deep sense of unease. It wasn't just the fact that there was something strange in the woods, it was the way it seemed to be watching, like it knew I was there, even though I was physically far from it. I started to think about where I was standing, just a few hundred feet away, completely alone. I pulled the drone back a little, trying to get a wider view of the area, but I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever this thing was, it knew exactly where I was. The thought sent a shiver down my spine, and I realized just how vulnerable I was out there. The forest, which had seemed so peaceful just moments before, suddenly felt oppressive, like the trees were closing in around me. I decided to bring the drone back and pack up. As I lowered it, I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see something step out from behind a tree. The walk back to my car felt endless. Every snap of a twig, every rustle in the bushes made me jump. I'm not usually a paranoid person, but in that moment, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, not just by the drone, but by something else out there in the woods. When I finally got home, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I uploaded the footage to my computer to get a better look. Watching it on a larger screen only made it worse. The details were clearer, the shape of its head, the way it moved, almost calculated, like it was trying to avoid detection but failing just enough for me to see it. It had this unsettling intelligence in the way it held itself, like it was aware of the drone, aware of being watched, and maybe even amused by it. I zoomed in as much as I could, trying to convince myself it was just a shadow, maybe a trick of my eyes. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't deny what I was seeing. This thing was real, and it had been there, just a few meters away from me, hidden between the trees. It was almost like it wanted me to see it, but not too clearly, just enough to make me question everything. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every little sound outside my window made me tense up. I kept thinking about how close I had been, how I had been standing there, completely exposed, while this thing watched me. The footage was still on my computer, but I couldn't bring myself to share it. Who would believe me? And honestly, the thought of putting it out there made me feel uneasy, like I'd be inviting something I didn't understand into my life. The next morning, I almost deleted the footage, but I ended up just saving it to an external drive and putting it away. I haven't looked at it since. I can't really explain why, but something about that encounter felt like a warning. I don't know what I saw out there, and maybe I don't want to know. All I know is that I've lost the urge to go back to that part of the forest. The idea of stepping foot there again fills me with a kind of dread I can't shake. Maybe one day I'll look at the footage again, or maybe I'll share it with someone who knows more about this kind of thing. But for now, it's just a memory I'd rather not revisit. It's strange how one afternoon can change the way you see something so familiar. The forest used to feel like a place of peace, a place to escape. Now, it just feels like somewhere I'm not supposed to be, like I've seen something I wasn't meant to see, and that's enough for me to stay away. I never thought I'd be one of those people writing something like this, but after what's happened over the last few weeks, I kind of had to share it. I have a small farm in a very remote area, far from the city, and I've always enjoyed the tranquility it gives me. But recently, something strange and really scary happened here. To be honest, I'm still processing everything, and even telling you about it, I feel a chill run up my spine. It all started when I realized that the animal's drinking fountain was always empty in the morning, and it wasn't as if it was simply less full than it should have been. It was completely dry. At first I thought it might be a leak or, I don't know, the animal's drinking more than usual, but even though I refilled the water every night, in the morning it was still empty. This began to really annoy me, because refilling it wasn't that simple, and the amount of water that disappeared was considerable. My first suspicion was of a thief. Perhaps someone needed the water and decided to steal it at night. So I did what any reasonable person would do. I put up a hidden camera, nothing too sophisticated, just a trail camera that I used to monitor the animals from time to time. I wanted to catch whoever was doing it, so I could resolve the situation once and for all. That night, I couldn't sleep properly. I kept thinking about what could be going on. I know it sounds silly, but the thought of someone breaking into my property at night made me uncomfortable. When I woke up, I went straight to check the camera. I confess I was expecting to see some slacker neighbor or perhaps a teenager playing a prank, but what I saw was quite different. The video showed a creature, something big, bigger than anyone I've ever seen. Covered in fur, the figure moved slowly to the drinking fountain, bent down, and began to drink. And there was something very strange about the way it moved. Cautious, but not exactly like a wild animal. It seemed to be aware that it could be caught, looking around, listening for sounds. I watched the video over and over again, trying to find some indication that it was a prank or a hallucination, but there was no denying it. It was real. I felt my stomach turn. It wasn't just the idea that something bizarre was drinking my animal's water. It was the fact that I was sleeping just a few meters away, completely oblivious to everything. That being was in my backyard, so to speak. I spent the day trying not to think about it too much, but of course I didn't succeed. Deep down I was terrified, but I tried to keep calm and think practically. That afternoon, I decided to take a look around the watering hole. That's when I found the footprints. They were huge, like those of a human foot, but much bigger and deeper into the earth. My heart raced at the sight of them. Each footprint seemed to confirm that what I had seen on the video wasn't some shadow or trick of the light. It was real. Something had really been there last night. I decided to move the drinking fountain closer to the house. I wasn't sure what that would solve, but it was what I could do. I also started to avoid going out alone after dark. Something about the idea that that creature was still out there, prowling around, made me uncomfortable in a way I'd never felt before. Every little sound, every movement of the animals put me on alert. For a few weeks, nothing else happened, but the feeling that I was being watched didn't go away. It was as if everywhere I looked, I expected to see that thing again, as if it was always there, hiding, waiting for the right moment to appear. I stopped going out at night completely. I locked every window and door and always checked everything before going to sleep. Even now, I don't know exactly what it was. Some friends suggested that maybe it was some big animal like a bear, but bears aren't common here, and the way it moved, the way it seemed to observe its surroundings, it didn't look like just any animal. Some days I even managed to convince myself that it was all a coincidence, that perhaps I was exaggerating. But the footprints were there, and so was the video. I haven't seen anything like it again, and the water stopped disappearing after I moved the trough. But the feeling that something is watching me at night is still with me. Maybe it's just the trauma of having witnessed something I can't explain. But when I'm alone at night, in the dark of the farm, I still feel that there's something out there, something I can't see, but which is watching me. And honestly, I think the scariest thing of all is just that, the fact that there was never an explanation. It appeared out of nowhere and then stopped, as if I had been chosen for some reason, as if my farm had been a temporary target. And now, even without any more clues or signs, I can't help thinking that one day it might come back. I just hope I'm prepared if it does. I've never been one to believe in such things, you know. Stories about mysterious creatures, Bigfoot and so on. I always thought they were more entertaining than really scary. But my wife and I had an experience that makes me question all that now. We were returning from a short trip to a small town in the countryside. The plan was simple, a romantic getaway and a quiet drive home, but nothing went to plan that night. We decided to take a shortcut along the country road. It seemed like a good idea at the time. The GPS indicated that we'd be able to cut about 30 minutes, and the idea of taking a quicker route sounded perfect. The first few miles were normal, the road was dirt, and there aren't many lights out there, just the constant glow of our car's headlights illuminating the way ahead. Eventually, we started to get lost. The roads became increasingly narrow and confusing, and we started to run out of cell phone signal. It was past midnight, and all I wanted to do was get out of there. It was then that the main road simply disappeared, as if it had vanished into thin air. We were surrounded by trees, and further away from anything that looked like civilization. I decided to stop the car for a moment. I needed to figure out where to go, But before I even opened the map on my cell phone, I noticed a movement among the trees ahead. A large figure, tall and hairy, passed quickly, illuminated by the headlights. At first I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but then my wife grabbed my arm tightly, whispering to me to look in the right direction. And there it was again, a figure that looked over 2 meters tall, covered in dark fur, moving from one tree to another. But it didn't move like a wild animal. It seemed to be watching. Every time I tried to focus the headlights on it, it hid, as if it were aware of us. It was one of the strangest moments I've ever experienced. The creature seemed to be studying our movements. Whenever I turned the wheel to try a U-turn, it would reposition itself, keeping a safe distance, but never disappearing completely. The way it moved was almost human, but not quite. She was fast, but there was something heavy, deliberate about her movements. I felt vulnerable. It's hard to explain the fear I felt at that moment, but it was as if we had crossed a line we shouldn't cross. I was trying my best not to panic. My wife was terrified, and I had to do something. I started the car again and decided that if there was any direction to go, it was away from there. I started driving in reverse, back along the narrow track we had been following, trying to keep my eyes on the road and in the rear-view mirror at the same time, but I felt that the thing hadn't given up on us. What bothered me most was the feeling of being watched. It was almost tangible, like a weight on my back. Every time I looked in the rear-view mirror, I had the impression of seeing something moving in the shadows, as if it were chasing us, but never clearly visible. It was always that glimpse, that movement out of the corner of your eye that makes you wonder if it's really happening. My adrenaline was running high, and my wife kept telling me to get out of there as quickly as possible. At a certain point, I completely lost track of where I was going. I couldn't think logically anymore. I just knew I had to keep going. That's when I spotted a small open field. The figure disappeared completely, as if it had left us alone as soon as we left the densest part of the forest. For a few minutes, we sat in silence in the car, just listening to our own panting, trying to understand what had just happened. It still took a while before we managed to get back onto the main road. It felt like we had been driving for hours. When we finally saw the lights of a gas station, it was as if a huge weight had been lifted off our shoulders. I pulled the car over and we breathed a sigh of relief. My wife was so nervous that she couldn't stop shaking. I asked her if she was sure what we had seen, and she just shook her head, her eyes full of tears. I don't know what it was, but since that night, we promised not to take any more shortcuts that we didn't know about. To this day, I get a shiver down my spine when I think of that creature, the way it moved, the way it seemed to watch us, as if we were invading its space. It seems surreal, but at the same time, as real as any other experience in my life. I know there are lots of stories out there, and many are just to scare you. But what happened to me and my wife wasn't a made-up story. I don't know if it was a Bigfoot or something else that lives in the forest, but the feeling of being hunted by something you don't understand is simply terrifying. It's not the kind of fear you feel when you're in the dark, but a deep, almost animal fear. Since that day, I find myself staring at the tree line every time I'm driving through isolated areas, and I wonder what exactly was there, watching us. Is it always there, watching the lost and the unwary who decide to cut across the road? I'd rather never find out. I never thought I'd write something like this here, but after what happened, I can't get it out of my head. Maybe sharing will help. I'm a truck driver, and because of my job, I have to drive through some very remote areas. There's one road in particular, a small route that cuts through a mountainous region, which I've started to avoid after a series of strange incidents. I'll try to explain what happened, but I'll warn you that it's one of those things that even if I tell you doesn't seem real. It all started with some fallen trees on the road. This is something that is not so uncommon on less busy roads, especially those that cross mountains. But it was the frequency that started to make me suspicious. Every time I passed by, there was a new tree blocking the way, always at a different point. And they weren't small branches, they were whole trees, some very thick, as if they had been pushed there on purpose. I spent weeks sidestepping or getting out of the truck to try and drag the trunks out, which, as well as being dangerous, was extremely tiring. After the 5th or 6th time this happened, I decided I needed to understand what was causing it. Maybe it was some kind of landslide or the wind, I don't know, but it didn't make sense for it to always happen at dawn, always blocking the middle of the road in a place where hardly anyone passed. I decided to camp near the road, taking my truck to an open area where I could have a wider view. I wanted to see what was happening with my own eyes. That night, I almost regretted coming up with the idea. I set up a small camp with a folding chair on the side of the truck and waited. The night was cold, and the silence was only broken from time to time by the sounds of the forest, those noises that you can never quite identify, but which, in isolated places, always seem louder. I was about to doze off when I heard a crack that woke me up instantly. It was the sound of wood splitting, a loud crack, as if something very heavy had broken a log. I got up slowly, trying not to make a sound. The moonlight was enough to give a little light, and that's when I saw it. A huge figure, taller than anyone I'd ever seen, covered in dark hair, was pushing over a tree. It was as if it was nothing to her. Her long, muscular arms were pushing the trunk as if it were a toy. I stood there, almost breathless, watching as the thing pushed the tree until it fell, completely blocking the road. My heart was racing, and all I could think was that I couldn't be seen. I didn't know what that thing would do if it realized I was there, and I didn't want to find out. I slowly crouched down, trying to hide behind the front of the truck, and waited. It seemed as if time had stopped, each second dragging by like an eternity. The creature looked around for a moment, as if making sure no one had seen what it had done, and then turned and walked back into the forest. I waited for a few minutes, which seemed like hours, until I was sure it wasn't coming back. When I finally plucked up the courage, I stood up slowly and walked over to where the tree had fallen. It was unbelievable. This was no wind or landslide. The tree had clearly been uprooted and pushed over with force. And around the trunk, you could see marks on the ground, like huge, deep footprints, which were definitely not those of any ordinary animal. I didn't waste any more time. I got back into the truck and took the long way around, even though I knew it would take much longer to reach my destination. I haven't used that road since. I don't know exactly what I saw, and maybe that's for the best. I have the feeling that the thing was trying to send me a message, as if telling me not to come back, and I decided to respect that. I still think about it a lot. I don't know if it was some kind of creature protecting its territory or something, but I don't want to find out. Every time I pass near that area, I feel a shiver run up my spine, and I avoid looking at those mountains. I prefer to go on my way and leave whatever is there alone. All I know is that, to this day, I can't forget the sound of that snap, nor the figure of that thing pushing the tree as if it were made of paper. I've never told anyone about it, apart from a few colleagues on the road, and even then, many don't believe me. But I know what I saw. And if there's one thing I've learned, it's that nature has its own secrets, and not all of them should be revealed. I wasn't really planning on sharing this, but I guess this is the right place to talk about it. To be honest, I still feel uneasy even thinking about that night, but maybe putting it out here will help me make sense of it. This happened about a year ago during one of my regular patrols as a wildlife ranger. I've been doing this job for a while now, and I've seen some strange things, but nothing, absolutely nothing like this. It started with small things. I was patrolling a reserve that I've known like the back of my hand for years. A few weeks before everything went down, I began to notice signs that didn't fit. There were dead animals, mostly deer and rabbits, left in really odd positions. Their bodies were laid out neatly, almost ritualistically, with their heads turned toward the deeper part of the forest, and their legs folded underneath them in a way that no natural predator would ever do. The first time I saw it, I thought it might be some sick person messing around. You know, poachers or some teenagers trying to scare people. After a couple of weeks of this, I decided to do something about it. The weirdest part was that none of the other rangers had seen it. I brought it up at our weekly meeting, but my colleagues just shrugged it off, said it was probably coyotes or just some scavenger behavior I hadn't seen before. But it didn't sit right with me. I know the difference between coyotes killing for food and whatever this was. So, one night, I decided to stay late and see if I could catch anything in the act. I found a spot not too far from where I'd discovered the last deer. It was around 11 p.m., cold, dark, with only the sounds of the wind moving through the trees. The forest has a kind of stillness at night that's both peaceful and eerie at the same time. I had my flashlight, my thermal binoculars, and, to be honest, I didn't expect much. I thought I'd just be staring into the dark until my shift ended. But, as it turned out, I didn't have to wait long. I heard something, heavy footsteps, but they weren't steady, almost like something dragging behind. It wasn't the usual scurrying of raccoons or the quick trot of deer. These were deliberate, heavy thuds. My first instinct was that it could be a bear, so I switched on my thermal binoculars, and that's when I saw it. I can't get that sight out of my head. There, about 50 yards away, was a figure. It was tall, way taller than any person, easily 7 or 8 feet, and it was covered in thick, matted hair. My heart skipped a beat as I realized it was carrying something. I adjusted the focus, and I could make out the shape of a deer. It had the deer by its neck, and it was dragging the carcass like it weighed nothing. I've seen bears, I've seen big animals, but the way this thing moved, it had a human-like gait, upright and powerful. My instincts were screaming at me to stay put, but curiosity got the best of me. I started to slowly inch forward, careful not to make any noise. I think I managed to take about 5 steps before the thing just stopped. It didn't look in my direction, but it sniffed the air. That's the part that gives me chills. It lifted its head and sniffed, like it knew I was there. I swear I felt my blood turn to ice. It turned, and in just a couple of strides it disappeared into the shadows, dragging the deer along with it. I stood there, frozen. I don't know how long I stayed like that, but eventually I forced myself to move. I went to where it had been, and sure enough, there were footprints, huge ones. They were deep, like something incredibly heavy had been standing there. I bent down to touch the impression, and I could feel the cold earth beneath my fingers. Whatever it was real, and it had been right there just moments before. I backed out of that area, not even bothering to look around anymore. I don't think I've ever felt fear like that, an instinctive, primal kind of fear that makes every hair on your body stand on end. I've dealt with plenty of dangerous situations in my job, but nothing like this. As soon as I got to my truck, I locked the doors and just sat there, trying to calm down. I didn't go back to that part of the reserve that night. The next day, I reported what I saw to my supervisor. He didn't believe me. I could tell by the look on his face. He gave me this patronizing smile, told me it was probably just a bear or my eyes playing tricks on me. But I know what I saw. It wasn't a bear, and it wasn't just my imagination. I stopped patrolling that area alone at night after that. I try to avoid it even during the day when I can. It's strange, but sometimes when I'm out there, I feel like I'm being watched. I know it sounds paranoid, but it's this constant feeling, like something is just beyond the tree line, hidden but there. A couple of times I've heard branches snap or caught glimpses of something moving, but when I turn to look, there's nothing. I haven't seen the creature again, and honestly, I hope I never do. I've tried to rationalize it. I've told myself it was just an animal, some rare species maybe, or maybe even some prankster in a costume, though deep down, I know none of those explanations really fit. I don't think I'll ever truly understand what I saw that night, and maybe that's for the best. All I know is that since that encounter, I've learned to respect the forest in a way I never did before. There are things out there that we don't understand, things that don't belong in the nice, neat world we try to create for ourselves. So yeah, I'm sharing this here because I guess I need to know if anyone else has experienced something similar. Maybe I'm not alone in this. Maybe someone out there has seen what I saw. I just hope, whoever they are, that they made it out safe, like I did. Barely. I still do my job, still patrol the reserve, but that night changed something in me. There's a part of the forest that's no longer just a bunch of trees and trails. It's a place of mystery, and honestly a place I'd rather not be after dark. Thanks for reading. If anyone has any thoughts or similar experiences, I'd really like to hear them. Maybe it'll help me make sense of all this, or maybe it'll just remind me that I'm not the only one who's seen what's out there. I never thought I'd end up telling this story here, but honestly, after what I experienced in that forest, I have to share it. I've worked in construction for over 15 years. I've done everything. I've worked on construction sites in the middle of nowhere. But this was by far the scariest experience of my life. It happened about 6 months ago, on an isolated project in the middle of the forest, a place where there was barely a phone signal. It was uncomfortable enough being so far from any city, but that job paid well, and most of the guys had to make the sacrifice. The night in question began like any other. We were all gathered in a makeshift camp, since we had to sleep there during the weeks of the project. It was cold and damp, typical of the middle of the forest. Suddenly, in the middle of the night, a crash echoed. It was loud, as if something had hit a tree with absurd force. Everyone woke up, some cursing and others trying to understand what was going on. We thought it might be an animal, perhaps a bear, but soon the sequence of noises continued, with increasingly loud and widely spaced thuds. I couldn't get back to sleep after that, and I wasn't the only one either. Paulo, one of the older guys on the team, suggested we should take a look. Something about the way the sounds echoed made me uncomfortable, but at the same time, I was too curious to just ignore it. I grabbed a flashlight, and Paulo decided to accompany me. We walked a little way towards the construction site where the noises seemed to be coming from. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. As soon as we got close to the area where the machines were parked, I felt a shiver run down my spine. The light from my flashlight passed through the trees, and between the shadows, I saw something that just didn't make sense. It was a huge, tall figure, covered in fur. It was on its back, but you could see that it was much bigger than anyone else. It seemed to be watching one of the excavators, as if it was trying to understand what it was. My hand was shaking so much that the flashlight almost fell off. Paul, next to me, was petrified. I wanted to run, to scream, but I couldn't do anything. All we could do was duck behind a bush and watch. The creature moved slowly, seemed curious, but also had something in its posture that left me with a primal fear, something I couldn't explain. After a few minutes that seemed like an eternity, it simply turned and walked away, disappearing into the trees, leaving only the heavy sound of branches breaking along the way. When we finally got back to camp, no one could sleep. We told the others what we had seen, and while some thought it was nonsense, others were clearly scared. The next morning, we went to the construction area, and it was there that the horror really hit home. There were huge marks on the ground, like footprints, but they were much bigger than anything I'd ever seen. One of the machines was damaged, as if something had ripped a part of it off by brute force. The crowd was silent for a while. No one wanted to admit what they were thinking, but it was clear that everyone was terrified. The site manager asked what had happened, and we just shrugged, preferring not to go into details. We didn't want to look crazy, but the fear on our faces spoke louder than any rational explanation. At that moment, an atmosphere of dread began to spread among all of us. Some of the guys, including Paulo, decided they weren't going to continue with the project. They said it wasn't worth risking their lives in a place like that. I stayed another day or two, but I couldn't stand it. Every night I kept listening to the sounds of the forest, waiting for that bang to come again, for that thing to appear again. The feeling of being watched never left me while I was there. Every snap of a twig, every breath of wind in the leaves, everything seemed to be a warning that we should get out of there. After I returned home, I tried to forget what had happened, but it's difficult. To this day, when I close my eyes, I can still see that huge figure, curious and frightening, moving between the machines, as if it were trying to understand what we were doing there. I don't know what it was, and frankly, I don't know if I want to know. All I know is that it wasn't something any of us could explain. Construction was suspended, and I never heard anything more about the project. The company simply abandoned the site, and none of us wanted to talk much about it afterwards. Most of the guys preferred to move on and pretend that nothing had happened. But I can't. There's something very wrong in that forest, and whatever it is, it doesn't want us to be there. Maybe it was just an animal. Maybe it was something we can't even understand. But the fear I felt that night was real, and I don't think it's going to leave me anytime soon. I'm not here to convince anyone. You may think I'm making it all up, that it's a story of someone who was impressed in the middle of the woods. But I know what I saw, and I know what I felt. And frankly, if you ever hear an unexplained bang in the middle of the forest, My advice is simple. Don't try to find out what it is. Some things should remain unknown. All right, I need to get this off my chest because I still can't quite believe what happened to me out there. I've been hunting for years, grew up doing it with my dad, and later with a few good friends. I've spent countless weekends out in the woods, braving cold nights, sometimes getting nothing, and other times coming back with more than enough to fill the freezer. But nothing, and I mean absolutely nothing, prepared me for what I saw that day. It was early January, the kind of day where everything's just silent, blanketed under a thick layer of snow. I remember waking up, the morning crisp and biting, and heading out alone while the others were still waking up, all slow from the cold. I wanted to get a head start, to see if I could spot any deer tracks before the others joined me. There was something about the solitude of the snow-covered forest that always called to me, that quiet crunch of boots breaking through fresh snow. It made me feel like I was in another world, disconnected from everything. About an hour in, I came across a set of tracks that just stopped me dead in my tracks. No pun intended. They were huge. I'm not talking about bear tracks or something similar. Those I can identify pretty easily. These were different. They looked eerily human, except much bigger than any foot I'd ever seen. The prints were deep, like whatever left them had serious weight behind it. And they led off into this dense part of the forest, a place none of us had ever really ventured into before. It was the kind of thicket that even deer avoid, with twisted trees and underbrush so thick you can barely see a few feet ahead. I knew better than to follow something like that. Trust me, I did. But there was this strange sense of curiosity, a pull that I couldn't shake. I've always considered myself a rational guy, but there was something about those prints that made my heart pound in a way I couldn't quite explain. So I started following them, slowly, carefully. The forest was quiet, almost too quiet, and every step I took seemed like it echoed off the trees. I could feel my own breath coming out in these shaky clouds, and the deeper I went, the more I started feeling like maybe this wasn't the best idea. A little while in, I started hearing something. At first I thought it was just the wind or maybe my imagination. You know how sometimes your mind plays tricks on you when you're alone in the woods. But then I heard it again. A low, guttural grunting sound, almost like an animal, but not quite right. It was rhythmic, and it felt like it was getting closer. I stopped, holding my breath, trying to pinpoint the direction it was coming from. And then I saw something move, just a flicker of dark against the white of the snow. My blood ran cold. I couldn't tell what it was, but it was big. I mean, bigger than anything I'd want to come face to face with. I crouched down behind a tree, heart pounding in my ears, straining to see it again. My hands were starting to sweat inside my gloves despite the cold, and every instinct I had was screaming at me to turn back. I don't know how to explain it, but there was this deep, instinctual fear that settled into my bones, something primal that said, "You're not supposed to be here." I finally got a clear glimpse of movement, this time much closer. It was tall, moving with a kind of deliberate grace that didn't match anything I'd seen in the wild before. Whatever it wasn't walking on all fours. It was upright, lumbering through the trees in a way that was almost too quiet for something of its size. My brain was trying to piece it together, trying to rationalize what I was seeing, but nothing made sense. My heart was racing, and I decided I'd had enough. Turning back was easier said than done. Every sound seemed amplified, and I could still hear that strange grunting somewhere in the distance, like it was following me. I tried to stay quiet, tried not to snap any branches or make too much noise, but every single step felt like a mistake. I'm not ashamed to say I was scared, more scared than I'd ever been in my life. My only focus was to get back to the camp, back to where the others were, and away from whatever was out there. When I finally made it back, I must have looked like I'd seen a ghost. My buddies were joking around, getting their gear ready, but when they saw my face, the laughter died pretty quick. I tried to explain what I'd seen, or what I thought I'd seen, but it came out all jumbled, and I could tell they thought I was losing it. But something about the way I was talking must have gotten to them, because one by one they all got quiet. I think they could feel that I wasn't messing around, that whatever happened back there had shaken me. We decided to pack up and leave. No one argued, and honestly, I think we all felt better getting out of there. We didn't say much while packing, and there was this weird tension hanging in the air. It was like we all knew that whatever was out there, we didn't want to find out more. The sun was starting to go down as we loaded up, and that feeling of being watched hadn't left me. I kept glancing back at the tree line, half expecting to see something staring back, but there was nothing, just the endless white and the creeping shadows. The next morning, we drove back to where we'd camped, just to see if we could find those tracks again. I think a part of me needed some kind of proof, something to show the others that I hadn't imagined it all. But when we got there, the snow had covered everything. It was like nothing had ever happened. Just an untouched blank canvas of white, no trace of the prints, no sign of anything unusual. To this day, I still can't explain what I saw out there. I've thought about it more times than I can count, tried to come up with some logical answer, but nothing fits. I know what bear tracks look like. I know the sounds animals make. But this was different. It felt different, like something I wasn't meant to see. My friends don't really bring it up anymore, and I don't blame them. Maybe it's easier to just pretend it never happened. But every now and then, when I'm alone in the woods, I get that feeling again, that sense that something's out there, just beyond what I can see. And I'll be honest, it keeps me from going too deep into the forest these days. I still hunt, but I've got my limits now. Whatever I saw, or whatever saw me, it's a memory that's never really faded. And honestly, I'm not sure I want it to. I've never been the superstitious type. I grew up in the countryside, and when you grow up like that, you learn that most night noises are the wind, chickens that won't shut up, or some small animal snooping around. So when the strange sounds started coming from my barn, I didn't worry too much at first. It seemed like something occasional, you know? A low rumble, as if the wind was shaking something. But after a few nights it got weirder. It was heavy, something that reverberated through the floor and even made my walls shake. I began to think it might be a bear. I finally decided to do something about it after a night when the sound was so loud that it got me out of bed. It was the sound of hay being shoveled, heavy and deliberate. Something or someone was moving the bales of hay inside the barn. What scared me wasn't even the noise itself, but the feeling that it didn't seem natural. It was rhythmic, almost as if it was being done for a purpose. Then one night, I grabbed my flashlight, put on my coat, and decided to end the mystery. I thought I'd come across a bear, or maybe a vagrant, trying to use the barn as shelter. I was wrong. I entered the barn at around 10 in the evening, just after sunset. My barn is one of those old ones, built by my grandfather, big and spacious, and it still has that typical gap between the wooden boards. I sat down in a corner, near the stairs leading up to the hayloft, making myself comfortable in the dark. The place had that strong smell of straw, and I remember the sound of the wind rustling the branches outside. For a while, I just stood there, listening to the silence and trying not to look ridiculous. I thought several times about giving up and going to sleep, but then I heard it. It was a footstep. It wasn't a subtle sound. It was as if something big was coming in, something heavy, walking slowly. The footsteps echoed across the wooden floor, and I could feel the barn almost vibrate. I held my breath, my eyes wide in the dark. Every step it took, I could feel the wood beneath me shudder. It wasn't a bear. It didn't walk like a four-legged animal. It was bipedal, and each step had a purpose, a rhythm that was almost human, but different. Noises started to come from the side of the hay, and I heard the sound of bales being moved. I slowly crept over to a gap between the boards, my heart pounding in my chest, trying to see what was causing it. When I looked, I swear my blood ran cold. It was a tall figure, but much taller than any man I've ever seen. Its shoulders were broad, and it was covered in thick, dark hair that swayed with every movement. I saw the creature move a bale of hay as if it weighed nothing, something that I alone would find difficult to even shift. I didn't know what to do. My flashlight was by my side, but the last thing I wanted was to attract attention. I crouched even lower, trying not to make a sound. I could hear his heavy breathing, a low sound, almost like a grunt, but constant. He seemed to be looking for something, or maybe just exploring. My stomach churned and my legs trembled. I knew that if it saw me, there wouldn't be much I could do. It was too big, too strong. I stood there for maybe 20 minutes, but it felt like hours. I could hear the creature moving, the sound of hay being pushed, and sometimes I could hear it sniffing the air as if it were trying to pick up a scent. I felt trapped, and every second that passed was torture. My fear was so strong that it was almost difficult to breathe. I don't remember praying so much in my life. I just wanted it to go away. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the footsteps began to move away. I heard the sound of the barn door creaking and the footsteps getting farther away until there was nothing left but the sound of the wind. Even so, I remained motionless, only managing to relax once I was absolutely sure that I was alone. I think I stayed there for another good 30 minutes before I had enough courage to get up and leave. I left the barn slowly, every muscle in my body tense. The night outside seemed darker than before, and the silence was almost oppressive. I ran into the house and locked the door behind me as if my life depended on it. That was the moment I realized that what I had seen wasn't a bear, and it wasn't something I could explain. I knew it was real, that it had been there, and that it wasn't just a figment of my imagination. Since that night, I don't go back to the barn after sunset. I lock up before dark and make sure the doors are shut tight. Something about that place has changed for me, and even during the day, I can't help but feel a chill run down my spine whenever I go in there. I've told a few friends about it, but no one seems to really believe me. They say that maybe it was my mind playing tricks on me, or that maybe I saw some kind of animal and exaggerated. But I know what I saw. That creature was different, something I can't fit into anything I know. It wasn't a bear, it wasn't a man. It was something in between, and the way it moved, the way it stirred the hay, that wasn't something an animal would do. To this day, I try not to think about it too much, but there isn't a day that goes by that I don't remember that silhouette, the heavy footsteps, and the sound of her breathing. I've never heard anything like it coming from the barn since, and I'm grateful for that. But every time it gets dark, I make sure to lock up and stay away. I don't know what it was, I don't know where it came from, and frankly, I don't want to find out. Whatever it is, I hope it never comes back. I swear, I'm never going back to that lake, at least not at night. This happened about a year ago, and I still get chills just thinking about it. My friend Mike and I had planned this fishing trip for weeks. We wanted a quiet spot, somewhere away from people, somewhere that felt like we were escaping everything. So we picked this lake, a place pretty much no one goes because it's so out of the way. It's known for its silence, for the stillness that almost feels unnatural. Honestly, that's what drew us to it. We thought it would be peaceful. It was a bit of a hike to get there, and by the time we had our boat in the water and our lines set, it was already late afternoon. The lake was everything we expected, calm, eerily quiet, almost like the world had paused. There wasn't even a breeze. The only sound was the occasional plop of a fish breaking the surface. As the sun set, everything got even quieter. No birds, no bugs, nothing. It was kind of strange, but we didn't think much of it. We were just two guys trying to catch some fish and enjoy the night. Around midnight, we'd had a few bites, but nothing worth bragging about. We were relaxed, talking about nothing in particular, when we heard it. A snap, like a thick branch breaking. It wasn't a small crackle. It was loud, deliberate. Mike and I just looked at each other, both of us immediately quiet. We tried to brush it off, maybe a deer or something, but a minute later, there it was again, another snap, closer this time. Then, the sound of something, or someone, moving through the underbrush. It's funny how fast your mind starts racing. I remember thinking it could be a bear, maybe even another person who found our little spot. But there was something different about the way those steps sounded. They were heavy, deliberate, almost like something big was trying to move quietly, but couldn't. We switched off our lantern and just sat there listening. The night was so dark, we could barely see past the edge of the boat. That's when we heard the water splashing, like something big had stepped into the lake. My heart was pounding at this point. The splashing was getting louder, and then we saw it. A shadow, this massive figure on the shore, just at the edge of the water. I couldn't make out details, but it was tall, like way taller than any person should be, and covered in what looked like shaggy fur. It was bent over, like it was searching for something in the water. I could see its arms, long and almost ape-like, dipping into the lake. Mike whispered something, but I couldn't even process what he was saying. All I could think was, "This is not normal." We were both frozen. I'm not sure how long we sat there, just watching, but it felt like forever. The thing kept moving along the shore, almost like it was following something in the water, its head turning slowly side to side. We didn't dare move. I remember feeling the urge to just paddle away as fast as we could, but I also knew that if we made any noise, it might notice us. So we stayed completely still, barely even breathing. After what felt like hours, the splashing stopped. The figure stood there, perfectly still. My eyes were straining, trying to keep track of it in the darkness. Then, just like that, it turned and walked back into the trees, disappearing without a sound. The silence that followed was almost worse. We just sat there, too scared to even whisper. I could hear my own heartbeat, and I'm sure Mike could too. We didn't move until the first light of dawn started to break. I remember the relief I felt when the sky started to lighten, like I could finally breathe again. We quietly paddled back to the shore, packed up our gear without saying a word, and hiked back to the car. The whole way, we kept looking over our shoulders, half expecting to see that thing again, watching us from the trees. When we finally got to the car, we just sat there for a moment, trying to process what had happened. Mike looked at me, and I could tell he was just as shaken as I was. Neither of us had an explanation. It wasn't a bear, it wasn't a person, it was something else. Something that shouldn't be there. We've talked about it a few times since, but we always end up dropping it. There's just no way to make sense of it, and honestly, I think we both prefer not to dwell on it. But one thing's for sure, I'm never going back to that lake at night. Whatever we saw that night, it was real, and it was something I never want to encounter again. Now, every time someone mentions camping or fishing at an isolated spot, I get this tight feeling in my chest. It's weird, because I used to love being out in nature, especially at night. But after that night, something changed. The woods don't feel the same anymore. They don't feel peaceful. There's this constant feeling, like something's out there, watching. I know it sounds paranoid, but once you've seen something like that, you can't unsee it. You can't just pretend that the world is the same as it was before. I still go fishing, but only during the day, and always somewhere busy, with lots of people around. I guess that's the part that bothers me the most. I miss the quiet, the solitude, but I just can't bring myself to do it anymore, not after what we saw. And the weirdest part is, I don't even know what we saw. It's not like I can point to a picture and say, that's it. It's just this shadow in my memory, this tall, dark figure that doesn't fit anywhere in the world I thought I knew. So yeah, that's my story. I'm not here to convince anyone, and honestly, if someone told me this, I'm not sure I'd believe them either. But it happened. I don't know if it was Bigfoot or some kind of forest spirit or something else entirely. All I know is that it was there, and I never want to see it again. I never thought I'd be here writing something like this, but after that night, I simply had to share it. I know many of you have heard about strange things that happen in isolated areas, but I never thought it would happen in my lifetime. What I'm about to tell you happened about 3 weeks ago, and even now I can't stop thinking about it. I live with my family in a very isolated place. We're in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by forest. There are days when it's incredibly quiet, but there are nights when the silence just seems to add to all the strangeness around us. It all started with the animals, of course. There are a few chickens and pigs that we keep in the pens. Nothing much, just enough for our subsistence. Lately, the animals have been restless at night. I would wake up to the sound of the pigs stirring, as if they had smelled a predator. I even tried to ignore it at first, thinking it might be a wild dog or some smaller animal. But it got worse and worse. It's as if they knew something was there, something that wasn't common. The night I decided to stand guard, I'd had enough of the noise. I grabbed my flashlight and wrapped myself in a blanket to brave the early morning chill. I sat by the window overlooking the corral and kept an eye out. It was quiet at first, which was strange considering the last few days. There was no wind, no noise from animals, just that oppressive silence that is so common here in the countryside. I was about to doze off when I heard a sound, something light, like footsteps on dry earth. I pointed the flashlight, trying to see if it was one of the pigs escaping or something, but there was nothing. Then I noticed a shadow, very close to the pens. It was something big. The shadow wasn't like that of an ordinary animal. For a moment, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. I took the flashlight and shone it in the direction. At that moment, I saw it. It was huge, taller than anyone I've ever seen around here, and all covered in fur. It moved slowly, almost carefully, as it approached the chickens. My first reaction was to freeze. I knew I should make some noise, try to scare it away, but my body wouldn't respond. It seemed that my mind couldn't process what was in front of me. Finally, I managed to shine the flashlight straight into his face. That's when it really took off. I'm not talking about an animal that ran away on all fours or something. It stood up, like a human, getting even bigger. My eyes could hardly believe it. The creature looked in my direction but didn't stay there for long. It turned and ran into the woods with impressive agility, especially considering its size. The sound of the branches breaking as it disappeared is something I'll never forget. When I could move, I ran outside, straight to the corral. I had to make sure everything was okay. My heart was beating so fast that I could hardly breathe. When I got there, I realized that one of the chickens was missing. There was no sign of blood or anything, just the empty corral and a slightly ajar door. It seemed that it had opened the door in a way that no ordinary animal could. I told my family first thing in the morning, as soon as everyone woke up. I hoped they wouldn't believe me, but when I described what I'd seen, they all fell silent. My father decided that we should reinforce the security of the place. We spent the whole day putting extra locks, fences and traps around the corrals. I could see the fear on each of their faces that the thing might come back. Over the next few weeks, I don't think any of us could sleep properly. Every night, any sound made us jump out of bed. I kept looking out of the window, trying to see something moving in the darkness. I never saw it again, but I still couldn't shake the feeling that it was there, waiting. The animals were still a bit agitated, but nothing like before. It was as if everything had simply stopped suddenly, without explanation. I don't know what it was. Some people said it could have been a bear, but we don't have bears here. Others said that maybe I was tired seeing things, but I know what I saw. It wasn't a bear, it wasn't a man, it wasn't something I could understand. And that's what scares me the most. Maybe I'll never get an explanation, and that uncertainty is what makes it even worse. I hope it doesn't come back. I hope it was a one-off visit, that the thing found what it was looking for and decided not to come back. But every evening, when the sun goes down and the silence takes over the place, I can't help but feel a shiver run down my spine. I wonder if, one day, when I look out of the window, I'll see that huge figure again, standing on two legs, staring at me before disappearing into the darkness. And honestly, I don't know if I'm ready for that. All right, so I've never been one to write much online, but I need to get this out. Maybe it's just to hear from someone who's experienced something similar, or maybe just to unload. This happened about 2 weeks ago, and it still gives me chills every time I think about it. I usually like to keep things logical, but I can't seem to wrap my head around this one. I often go up to this local lookout near my town. It's this wooden platform that sits at the edge of a steep drop, giving you a wide view of the forest below. I love photography, especially wildlife photography, and this spot has always been one of my favorites. You can see birds, deer, and sometimes even foxes if you're lucky. The forest stretches for miles, dense and deep, and honestly, there's something so peaceful about it. Just me, my camera, and the quiet rustle of the wind. On this particular afternoon, everything felt pretty normal. The weather was cool, the sky was slightly overcast, and there weren't many people around. Actually, I was alone. I was there for at least an hour, maybe more, snapping shots of anything that moved. I remember focusing on a woodpecker, trying to get just the right angle, when I had this weird feeling. You know that sensation when someone's watching you? It was sudden, like a prickling at the back of my neck. I brushed it off at first. After all, there was no one there. Eventually, I packed up my gear, ready to head back home. But I always do this thing where I quickly review some of the shots before leaving. It's just a habit, checking to make sure I got what I wanted before I lose the light. I was scrolling through the pictures, and that's when I saw it. It was in one of the wider shots I had taken of the forest. There was this shape, a tall, shadowy figure standing among the trees. At first, I thought maybe it was just a trick of the light, a shadow cast by a tree or something. But the more I zoomed in, the clearer it got. It was tall, easily taller than any person I'd ever seen, and it was covered in what looked like thick, dark fur. The thing that really got me, though, was its face. Even though it was partially obscured by branches, I could see two glints of light where the eyes were. They were looking straight at the camera, straight at me. There was this weird look to it, almost like curiosity, but also something else I couldn't quite place. It wasn't just staring. It felt like it knew I was there. My stomach dropped. I mean, I've seen weird things in photos before, light reflections, random animals in the background. But this was different. I felt an honest-to-God shiver run down my spine. I didn't even take more time to look closer. I just felt this rush of anxiety, like I needed to leave, now. My heart was pounding in my ears, and suddenly the quiet of the forest didn't feel so peaceful anymore. It felt wrong, like the whole atmosphere had shifted without me noticing. I grabbed my stuff and started down the path that led back to my car. The whole time, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone anymore. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see something or someone coming up behind me. But there was nothing, just trees, shadows, and the sound of my own footsteps crunching on the gravel. I've never felt so exposed before. The lookout, which usually felt like my little haven, suddenly felt like a stage, and I was the only actor under a spotlight. When I finally made it to my car, I almost dropped my keys trying to unlock the door. I slammed it shut behind me, locked it, and just sat there for a minute, trying to catch my breath. I remember looking back at the path that led up to the lookout, half expecting to see that tall figure standing there. But it was empty. The forest was just as still as it had been when I arrived, and for a moment I wondered if I had imagined the whole thing. That night, I showed the picture to a friend. He took one look at it and got this serious look on his face. He told me I should avoid going back there for a while, said it looked like whatever it was knew I was watching it, and maybe it didn't like that. I laughed it off at first, but deep down, I think I agreed with him. There was something about the way it was looking at me, even through the photo, that made me feel uneasy. Like it was aware of me, not just as a passerby, but as someone intruding into its space. I haven't been back to that lookout since. I keep thinking about it, though, wondering what it was. I've heard stories about strange things in the woods, but I've never believed any of it until now. Bigfoot, forest spirits, whatever you want to call it, I don't know. All I know is that something was there, and it saw me just as clearly as I saw it. And it's that look, that weird mix of curiosity and something else, something darker, that keeps me up at night. I still have the photo. I've thought about posting it here, but honestly, I'm not sure if I want to. Part of me doesn't want to know what people might see if they looked at it. Maybe they'd just see a shadow, a trick of the light. Or maybe they'd see exactly what I saw, and confirm that I wasn't just imagining things. Either way, I'm not ready for that yet. For now, I'm just trying to move on, to forget the feeling of those eyes on me. But it's hard. Every time I close my eyes, I see that shape standing there, almost blending in with the trees, watching. And I keep wondering, if I hadn't noticed it in the photo, would I have felt it there anyway? Was it watching me the whole time I was up there, unaware, just waiting for me to see it? I don't think I'll ever get that answer, and maybe that's for the best. Some things, I think, are better left unknown. Anyway, I'm curious if anyone else has experienced something like this. I know it sounds crazy, but if you've ever felt like there was something out there, something more than just animals and trees, well, maybe we're not as alone as we think we are.